Hello beautiful people, welcome to Wizardium. In today's episode we explore what if Amelia Bones, Sirius Black and Remus Lupin raised Harry and Hermione. Hit like, subscribe and join our community of story lovers. Let's begin. Chapter 1, The Papers. The owl arrived at 3 in the morning. Amelia Bones was already awake, had been awake since 11, when the first reports started trickling into the Department of Magical Law Enforcement about strange things happening across Britain. Celebrations in Diagon Alley, fireworks over Glasgow, a wizard in Bristol who'd apparated into the middle of a muggle street and started crying and hugging strangers. She'd sent 4 auras to manage the containment situations and had spent the rest of the night at her kitchen table in Yorkshire with cold tea and a stack of intelligence reports, trying to figure out what exactly had happened in Godric's Hollow. She knew most of it by midnight. Voldemort was gone, dead or something close enough to it that it made no practical difference right now. The Potters were dead, both of them, and their son was alive and apparently responsible for whatever had happened to the Dark Lord, though nobody could explain the mechanism and Amelia distrusted things she couldn't explain. She'd written 3 separate memos to the minister asking for someone to secure the cottage and preserve the evidence before half of Wizarding Britain tromped through it out of curiosity or grief or both. Nobody had written back. The owl that arrived at 3 in the morning was Dumbledore's, an enormous bird with silver feathers that regarded her with the particular superiority of a creature that knew exactly how important its employer was. It dropped a letter on her kitchen table and sat there watching her open it as though it expected applause. She read the letter twice. Then she set it down very carefully, took off her monocle, cleaned it, put it back on, and read the letter a 3rd time. The boy will be placed with his remaining family, Dumbledore had written in that careful looping script she'd seen on 100 ministry circulars. His mother's sister Petunia Dursley and her husband Vernon of number 4 Privet Drive, Little Winging, Surrey. The blood protection Lily cast requires it. I trust you understand the necessity of discretion in this matter. The boy must be kept safe and for his own protection, ignorant of his nature until the appropriate time. I have made the arrangements. Hagrid will collect him tonight. Amelia sat with that letter for a long moment. Then she picked up her wand and sent a Patronus, a large, no-nonsense wild boar that she'd always thought suited her perfectly, streaking through the wall of her house toward London. She had calls to make. The thing about Albus Dumbledore Amelia had observed over 20 years of professional interaction was that he operated on the reasonable assumption that people would defer to him. Not because he was arrogant, he was genuinely, unfailingly kind, but because deference had become such a consistent feature of his life that he'd stopped noticing it as a variable. He made decisions and the decisions stuck. That was simply how it worked. He arrived at her kitchen table at 4:30 looking exactly as grave and twinkly as he always did, offered Fawkes's left wing to her owl in a gesture of avian diplomacy, and accepted the cup of tea she handed him before she sat down across from him and said, "Tell me about the Dursleys." "A perfectly ordinary Muggle family," he said. "Safe, stable. Have you met them?" A slight pause, barely noticeable. "I have observed them." Junior Dursley née Evans, who told her sister that magic was a disgusting freak abnormality and hasn't spoken to her since 1978. Amelia slid a thin folder across the table. She'd had someone from the department pull it together in under an hour, which was the advantage of having staff who knew not to ask questions at 4 in the morning. Vernon Dursley, whose correspondence with his colleagues contains 17 documented uses of the word abnormal as a pejorative. Their son Dudley is 14 months old. The neighbors have filed 2 noise complaints about the manner in which the boy is disciplined. Dumbledore looked at the folder without touching it. Blood protection requires. Blood protection, Amelia said, is a theoretical construct that Lily Potter appears to have actualized through her sacrifice and which has never been successfully replicated or verified in controlled conditions. I'm not dismissing it. I'm telling you I need more than a theory to justify placing a traumatized infant with a woman who called his mother a freak. She kept her voice even. This was the most important skill in any negotiation, staying calmer than the other person expected you to. I'm also telling you that ignorant of his nature until the appropriate time is not a child welfare policy, it's a strategy. It is both, Dumbledore said quietly. The boy needs protection, Amelia, from those who would exploit him. From the attention that would follow him if his identity were known, he needs a childhood. I agree completely. She folded her hands on the table, which is why I've begun custody proceedings. Silence stretched across the kitchen. The owl ruffled its feathers. Fawkes made a soft sound that might have been surprise. Amelia, I'm head of magical law enforcement, she said. That means I have statutory authority to intervene in cases of foreseeable child endangerment. And I am telling you right now, Albus, that placing Harry Potter in that house constitutes foreseeable endangerment. I don't need the Wisengamot's approval to file emergency temporary custody. I need 2 witnesses and a ministry seal, both of which I already have. She paused. I also have a house, 3 bedrooms, and a niece who is 17 and about to start aura training and would rather eat her own robes than let any harm come to a child. She thought of Susan, who had cried for an hour when she heard about the Potters, and then dried her eyes and asked if there was anything she could do to help. He'll be safe here, genuinely safe, not theoretically safe. Dumbledore was quiet for a long time. His half-moon glasses caught the lamplight, and for a moment she couldn't read his expression at all. There are forces at play, he finally said, that go beyond what any legal document can address. There are always forces at play, Amelia said. That's not a reason to stop using legal documents, it's a reason to use better ones. He left an hour later, and she wasn't sure she'd won the argument so much as made it clear that losing wasn't an option she was entertaining. Dumbledore was not a man who issued ultimatums or made threats. He simply looked at her with those blue eyes full of a weight she couldn't quite name and said, "I hope you know what you're taking on," and she said, "I've been taking things on since I was 22, Albus. I know exactly what I'm doing." She wasn't entirely sure that was true. But she knew what happened to children in houses where they weren't wanted, and she knew what her conscience would do to her if she let it happen to this particular child when she had the power to stop it, and that was enough to work with. Hagrid arrived at dawn with the baby. Harry Potter was 13 months old and apparently entirely unbothered by the destruction of his home, the death of his parents, and the collapse of the most significant dark magical presence in a century. He sat in Amelia's kitchen and pulled at her reading glasses and said "bah" several times with great conviction, and she held him somewhat awkwardly. She had never been a particularly natural person with small children, and thought about Lily Potter, who she'd known slightly, who had been one of the brightest young auras of her generation, who had made exactly the right impossible choice at the worst possible moment. "He looks like James," Hagrid said, scrubbing at his eyes with a handkerchief the size of a small tablecloth. "Got Lily's eyes, but he's got James's face." "I know," Amelia said, because she'd met James Potter twice at ministry functions, and the resemblance was already striking even at 13 months. She handed the baby a wooden spoon from the kitchen drawer because he kept reaching for things, and she'd rather he grabbed something that wasn't a wand or a classified document. He accepted this with enormous dignity and immediately began banging it on her knee. "Hagrid, what I'm about to do is going to make some people very unhappy. I need you to understand that." "I understand," Hagrid said. He looked at the baby with something raw and grateful in his enormous face. "Professor Dumbledore's gonna be, well, he's not gonna like it." "No," she agreed. "But I found that doing the right thing and being liked for it are two separate ambitions, and trying to achieve both simultaneously tends to compromise the first one." She looked at the child in her arms, who was looking back at her with those remarkable green eyes, steady and unafraid. "He'll be safe here, I promise." The business with Sirius Black took slightly longer. He'd been arrested in the immediate chaos of November 2nd by auras who were working on 2 hours of sleep, and the assumption that anyone at the scene of a catastrophe must have caused it. Amelia had been trying to unpick the legal mess ever since, hampered by the fact that 12 muggles were dead, a street had been destroyed, a known Death Eater named Peter Pettigrew had apparently been disintegrated, and everyone in the relevant chain of command had concluded that Sirius Black was guilty before asking him a single question. She visited him in Azkaban herself 6 days after the arrest, because she'd read his file and something in it troubled her. Black was in a bad way, the Dementors were doing their work and he'd clearly slept very little, but his eyes were focused when she sat down across from him, and the first thing he said to her was, "Where's Harry?" "Safe," she said, "with me." Something shifted in his face so completely that he looked like a different person for a moment. Then the Dementor in the corridor drifted past and the grey settled back over him. "He was secret keeper," she said, not as an accusation. She needed information. "Pettigrew." "Yes," his voice was rough. "We switched. James's idea. We thought no one would suspect Peter. He was so ordinary. We thought Voldemort would go after me because it was the obvious choice." He laughed, and it was a terrible sound. "Turns out ordinary is its own kind of camouflage. You confronted him." "I went to confront him. Yes, I was going to." He stopped. "I don't know what I was going to do. He saw me coming and he started screaming before I even got close. Screaming that I'd betrayed them, that I'd sold them to Voldemort right there in the middle of the street, loud enough for every muggle in the area to hear. Then he blew up the street and cut off his own finger and transformed and disappeared into the sewer before I could." He pressed his hand over his face. "I just stood there. I couldn't. James was dead and Lily was dead and Peter had just..." His voice broke. "And I just stood there laughing, because what else was there to do? It was so perfectly Peter, right to the end." Amelia wrote nothing down. She had a very good memory and she'd learned a long time ago that people talked more freely when they couldn't see you taking notes. "You're an unregistered animagus." He looked up sharply. "It's in the file that James Potter was also one," she said. "You don't become registered animagi at 15 without practicing together. And Peter Pettigrew was small and disappeared into a sewer, which tells me exactly what his form was. If you're going to lie to me, Sirius, do it now while I can still manage the paperwork, because later it becomes a very different problem." A long pause. "A dog," he said. "Large black dog." "Right." She stood up, snapped her notebook shut from pure habit. "I'm going to need Remus Lupin's testimony. He was with you when you were registered as a group." "He wasn't. We were never." "He knows about all of this," she said, "which means he's a witness whether he wants to be or not." She looked at Black directly. I believe you. I want you to understand that. I believe you, and I am going to get you out of here, and it is going to take time, and it is going to require you to be patient and cooperative, which I understand is not historically your strong suit. Can you do that? He stared at her for a long moment. Outside the cell, the Dementor drifted back the other direction, trailing cold. For Harry, he said finally. Yeah, I can do that. Good. She gathered her coat. Don't do anything heroic. Heroic in Azkaban looks the same as criminal. I'll be back in 2 weeks. Remus Lupin was living in a one-room flat in Peckham that was, charitably, Spartan. The window had a crack in it sealed with speller-tape, and there was a stack of books by the door that served as furniture as much as library. He answered her knock looking like he hadn't slept in a week, which she suspected was less about insomnia and more about the full moon 3 days prior. He was wearing robes that had been mended in several places, and he held himself with the particular careful stillness of someone who'd learned to take up as little space as possible. She'd known Remus Lupin slightly from his Order of the Phoenix involvement, and she'd read his file before coming, and she had opinions about what the Ministry's werewolf legislation had done to a decorated war veteran, but she kept those opinions out of her voice when she said, I need your testimony, Mr. Lupin, about Sirius Black, Peter Pettigrew, and what happened in Godric's Hollow. I also need you to tell me everything you know about Peter Pettigrew's animagus form. He sat down heavily on the edge of his mattress. He didn't ask how she'd found him. He'd been expecting this, she thought, or something like it. He's innocent, Remus said. It didn't come out easily. She could see him working through something internal, something that had to do with the fact that he doubted it himself at some point before the evidence settled. I know he's innocent. I should have gone to someone sooner, but I couldn't. He pressed his hands together, stared at them. Was so sure it was him for a while because it made a horrible kind of sense. He'd been different that last year, withdrawn, and I thought maybe the war had changed him in ways I hadn't. He stopped. It was Peter the whole time, I just couldn't see it. You were grieving, she said, without particular softness but without cruelty either. Your entire world had just ended. Grief isn't an excuse, but it's an explanation. I should have been more certain of him. Perhaps. But you're certain now, and that's what I need. She waited until he looked up. Peter Pettigrew was a rat animagus. Something went through Remus Lupin's eyes at that, a grief so specific it had teeth, and she understood suddenly that this wasn't just about James and Lily. It was about the boy he'd been, 13 years old and learning a piece of magic that should have been impossible, doing it with the 3 people he loved most in the world. All of that was gone now, and 2 of them were dead, and the 3rd had turned out to be a traitor. The 4th was the one she was trying to get out of prison. Yes, he said quietly. His name was Scabbers. They all kept saying how small Peter was for a rat, that he looked old and mangy. He let out a breath. He was enormous for a rat, we just never connected it. Will you testify to that, in front of the Wisengamot? He looked at her steadily. I know what testifying as a werewolf will cost me, politically, the way they'll frame it. There was no self-pity in it, just assessment. I know, she said. I'm asking anyway. He nodded slowly. For Sirius, yes. Good. She stood, then, because she'd been thinking about it since she arrived, and she might as well say it. There is also the question of Harry. He is currently in my care, and I expect he will be for the foreseeable future. She paused. He's going to need people who knew his parents, people who can tell him who they actually were, not a mythology of them. She looked at Remus directly. I'm not offering charity, Mr. Lupin. I'm offering a position. Part-time initially, teaching, tutoring, whatever you're qualified for, which based on your academic record is quite a lot. Room and board included. Before you decide whether that's patronizing, because she could see the protest forming, consider that I have a 13-month-old child who is already doing accidental magic at a rate that suggests he'll need a specialist, and that I have a 40-hour-week job running a division of the ministry, and that I could use the help. Remus stared at her for a long moment. You're offering me a home, he said carefully, like he was testing the word. I'm offering you an employment arrangement, she said. If it becomes something else, that's between you and the household. He came the following Tuesday with 3 boxes of books and a battered leather satchel and an expression that was trying very hard to be neutral and not quite succeeding. The 2nd child arrived in February. Amelia got the call at 7 in the morning, a Muggle family in Hampstead targeted in their home overnight. Evidence of 2 wands worth of dark magic, both adults deceased. The daughter, 9 years old, found by neighbors hiding under the stairs with her arms wrapped around a tabby cat who turned out on inspection to be her neighbor's Kneasel cross. The girl had somehow managed to cast what looked like a rudimentary shield charm with no wand and no training, which had kept the killing curse from reaching her, and which had killed the second aura's skepticism about Muggle-born children on the spot. She was sitting in a Muggle hospital in a thin paper gown, and she had dark curly hair and very large brown eyes, and the expression of someone who had locked a door in their mind, and was holding it closed through sheer willpower. The Muggle police officers in the corridor were talking about emergency foster placement. Ministry representative was waiting to administer a memory modification and a referral to the department for the relocation of magically affected persons, which was about as helpful as it sounded. Amelia sat down next to her and said, My name is Amelia Bones, what's yours? The girl looked at her with those large, steady eyes. Hermione, she said. Hermione Jean Granger. Her voice was careful and precise even now. Even here, my parents are dead. I know, Amelia said. I'm sorry. They died because of me, Hermione said. Because I'm magical. The people who came, they were looking for magical children, muggle-borns. I heard them say it. Yes, she didn't soften it. She decided on the way over that this particular child would not be served by softness of the dishonest kind. That's probably true. There are people who believe that being muggle-born makes you a lesser kind of witch. Those people are wrong, and they are also dangerous, and they killed your parents because of that belief. Hermione absorbed this. Her hands were folded in her lap and she didn't look away. Are they going to come back? Not to you, Amelia said. Not if I have anything to say about it. A long pause, the tabby cat still present somehow despite being in a hospital, which Amelia filed away, jumped onto the bed and settled next to Hermione, and the girl put her hand on its back automatically. I don't have anywhere to go, Hermione said. Not a complaint, just information offered in the same careful way she'd offered everything else. You do actually, Amelia said. You'll come with me. I have a house in Yorkshire, and a ward who is about 2 years younger than you and who is, I should warn you in advance, already developing strong opinions about everything. Something flickered across Hermione's face, not quite a smile, not anything as simple as that, but a softening of the held door expression, just slightly. Strong opinions about what? At current count, Quidditch, broom safety, and the correct way to sort a sock drawer. The not-quite smile became real for just a moment. Those seem like very different things. They are, Amelia said. He's a versatile child. She handled the paperwork by noon. She did not ask the ministry representative's permission. She informed him, filled in his forms for him to save time, and left with Hermione in the ministry car before anyone senior enough to argue had gotten out of their morning meeting. She told Harry that evening, while Remus sat at the kitchen table pretending to grade fourth-year essays and actually listening to everything. Harry was just past 2 years old and had his father's hair and his mother's eyes and a personality that seemed to be forming itself along the lines of I would like to know about everything right now, please. He had been following Amelia around the kitchen for 20 minutes asking who in various intonations while she made tea. We're going to have someone else living here, she told him, crouching down to his level. A girl named Hermione. She's a bit older than you. She's going to need you to be kind to her. Harry considered this with great seriousness. Why? Because she's sad. Another pause. He had, even at 2, an uncanny ability to sit with information instead of reacting immediately to it. She'd noticed this and suspected it was partly temperament and partly the fact that Remus Lupin, who was almost entirely composed of quiet attentiveness, had been his primary daytime companion for 3 months. Harry said finally. And then can she play? I expect she can, Amelia said. He seemed satisfied. He went back to his sock drawer project, which was, she had to admit, surprisingly well organized for a 2-year-old, and she stood up and met Remus's eyes across the kitchen, and something passed between them that wasn't quite a smile but was close to one. Relief, maybe. The particular relief of people who are trying to do an impossible thing, and have just been reminded that children are, at their best, astonishingly simple and good. Hermione arrived that night with 1 suitcase and her library books, 7 of them, all returned properly to the Hampstead Library before she'd agreed to come, because she was 9 years old and had just been orphaned and had still insisted on returning her library books, and stood in the doorway of the Bones house looking at the warm yellow light coming from the kitchen, and the sound of something sizzling on the stove and the distant noise of a toddler negotiating loudly about bedtime. Amelia stood behind her and didn't rush her. After a moment, Hermione stepped inside. Sirius Black walked free on a Wednesday in March, 4 months after his arrest. The trial had been 3 days of Amelia at her most precise and relentless, walking the Wizengamot through every inconsistency in the prosecution's case, Remus's testimony about Pettigrew's animagus form and behavior in the months before the betrayal, and a pensive examination of the street where it had happened that clearly showed the wand movements consistent with a blasting charm originating from Pettigrew's direction. Chief Warlock tried twice to direct the proceedings away from the animagus question on the grounds that it was circumstantial. Amelia explained, in the tone she reserved for people who were technically senior to her but wrong, that it was not circumstantial but rather the central mechanism of the crime, and that she was happy to walk the Wizengamot through the sequence of events again as many times as needed until everyone was clear on the distinction. The Chief Warlock did not try a 3rd time. Not guilty, 12-3. Sirius walked out of the ministry chambers blinking in the light and looking like a man who'd forgotten what it felt like to stand in a room where Dementors weren't. He'd lost weight and there were shadows under his eyes that she didn't think would fully leave for a long time, and he stood on the ministry steps for a long moment just breathing. Then he turned to Amelia and said, "Where is he?" "Yorkshire," she said. "I'll take you now if you're ready." He nodded. "Then you have him, you really, he's fine," she said. "He's 2 years old and he has opinions about Quidditch and he reorganizes the sock drawer when he's bored." Sirius's face did something complicated and private and she looked away to give him a moment. "There's also a girl," she said. "Hermione Granger, 9 years old, Muggle-born. Her parents were killed in February. She's been living with us for 2 months. "Oh," Sirius said. He processed this. "Is she extraordinary?" Amelia said. "Terrifying in the most promising way possible." He almost smiled. It wasn't fully there yet, not the real one she remembered from James's stories, but it was coming. Right then, Yorkshire. They apparated together and arrived outside the house as the sun was going down, and Harry was in the garden with Remus, and the moment Sirius came through the gate, Harry looked up with those green eyes sharp and curious, and Sirius crouched down and said, "Hey there, mate. I'm Sirius, I was your dad's best friend." Harry looked at him for a long moment, then he held up the small rock he'd been examining and said, "Look, that," Sirius said, his voice entirely steady except for the very slight way it wasn't, "is an excellent rock." Harry seemed satisfied. He placed the rock carefully in Sirius's palm like it was a gift, which it was, and went back to examining the garden with the focused attention of someone with a great deal of scientific work ahead of them. Sirius sat down on the garden path, cross-legged, holding a rock, and Remus sat beside him and didn't say anything for a while, and Amelia watched from the doorway and thought, well, this is a household then. Not a conventional one, not the kind anyone had planned for, but the kind that forms when people with nowhere else to go end up in the same place and decide, more or less consciously, that they're not leaving. Hermione appeared at Amelia's elbow with a book open in her hands. "Did the man with grey hair pass?" she asked. She'd been following the trial through newspapers and through questioning anyone who came through the door. "Not guilty," Amelia said. Hermione looked at Sirius in the garden, then back at her book. "Good," she said with the decisive finality of someone marking a solved problem. "That was the correct verdict. The evidence was clear." She paused. "He looks tired." "He is," Amelia said. Hermione considered this. Then she went inside and came back 2 minutes later with a plate of biscuits, walked down the garden path, set them next to Sirius without a word, and went back to her book. Sirius looked at the biscuits, then at Remus. "That's Hermione," Remus said. "Right," Sirius said. He took a biscuit. "She's terrifying." "In the most promising way possible," Remus agreed. The four of them sat in the garden until dark, and the 2 children, and the 3 adults who had arrived at this arrangement through grief and law and stubbornness, and one carefully worded set of custody papers, and the house behind them was lit from every window, and it was, in whatever provisional and complicated way these things can be, a beginning. Chapter 2, The Household. The first time Harry Potter blew out every window on the 2nd floor, he was 4 years old and upset about a biscuit. Not even an important biscuit. A digestive plane, the kind Sirius bought in bulk because he had the sweet tooth of a Labrador and roughly similar self-control around food he liked. Harry had wanted it. Sirius had said no, it was too close to dinner. Harry had said yes. Sirius had said no again. Harry had turned a spectacular shade of red, and every single pane of glass on the upper floor of the Bones house had detonated outward simultaneously with a sound like a cannon going off. The silence afterward was profound. Harry stared at Sirius. Sirius stared at Harry. Somewhere upstairs, Hermione's voice drifted down with academic precision. "That was accidental magic, quite powerful for his age, actually." Sirius looked at the ceiling, then he looked at Harry, then he said, "You still can't have the biscuit." Harry burst into tears. It took Remus 3 weeks to replace all the glass, partly because he was meticulous about it and wanted the original thickness, and partly because sourcing it from non-magical suppliers in Yorkshire was logistically complicated. He did not complain about this. He did order a specific kind of reinforced glass for the dining room windows, because Harry's accidental magic episodes were becoming both more frequent and more spectacular, and he had a practical mind. It was Hermione who first suggested a structured approach. She was 9, going on 45, and she had already read everything in the house library twice, and had started writing to flourish and blots for additional texts, which Amelia funded without comment because an inquisitive child was an occupied child, and an occupied Hermione Granger was significantly less likely to reorganize the ministry paperwork Amelia brought home or conduct unsupervised experiments in the back garden. The experiments were never dangerous, they were simply thorough, which was in some ways worse. "If you channel it," Hermione told Harry one afternoon, sitting across from him on the kitchen floor with the gravity of a surgeon explaining a procedure, "into something specific, a directed intention rather than an emotional release, then the energy has somewhere to go. It's like the difference between a burst pipe and a garden hose." Harry looked at her. "You're not a professor." "Not yet," she agreed. He thought about this, then, "What do I direct it at?" "Something you want to happen." She held up a grape from the fruit bowl on the counter above them. "Make it move." He stared at the grape. He concentrated. The grape wobbled, rolled 2 centimeters to the left, and fell off the counter. Hermione caught it. She examined it with satisfaction. "You see, directed, no broken windows. I want to do it again, obviously." At the end of the afternoon, they had developed what Harry called the grape method, and what Hermione called basic telekinetic intent exercises, and what Remus, watching from the kitchen doorway with his tea, privately thought was the beginning of something that was going to make teaching them both very interesting in a few years. He mentioned this to Amelia that evening. "They're self-directing," she said, not looking up from her files. "They're 8 and 4, Remus said. Susan was self-directing at 6. She turned a page. "This family produces it." He considered whether to argue that Hermione wasn't technically family and decided against it on the grounds that it was both technically accurate and completely missing the point. Sirius taught them to duel on a Tuesday. Not the formal kind, not yet. They were too young for wand work and the formalized structure of it, but the philosophy of it, which he argued was more important anyway. He'd cleared the back garden on a cold October morning when Harry was 6 and Hermione 11, and he'd stood in the middle of it and said, "The first rule of a duel is that there are no rules." Hermione opened her mouth. "In theory," Sirius said, pointing at her preemptively, "there are rules. In practice, the person trying to kill you did not come in with the Ministry dueling regulations pamphlet. So you learn the theory, yes, absolutely, Remus will cover that, but then you forget you learned it and you remember this instead. The goal is to win, and winning means going home." Harry, who had been sitting on the garden wall eating an apple, said, "What about fair?" "Fair," Sirius said, "is for sports. In a fight you use everything you have in whatever order works, and you do not apologize for being better prepared than the person trying to hurt you." He looked at them both, alternating, his grey eyes direct and serious in a way they weren't always. "The Death Eaters who came for your parents, who came for Hermione's parents, they did not play fair, they never have. I am not teaching you to be like them, I am teaching you to be alive." He paused. "Questions? What was your best duel?" Harry asked immediately. Sirius grinned, and it was sudden and wolfish and entirely changed his face. "Year against 3 seventh-years who tried to take James's Marauder's map. I was outnumbered and wandless for the first 10 seconds. What happened? I stole one of their wands midway through, used both at once, and managed to confund us on 2 of them simultaneously before the third got a stinging hex in my ear." He touched his left ear where there was a faint scar if you look closely. "Still counts as a win. You used 2 wands," Hermione said, interest overtaking skepticism. "It's not as useful as it sounds. Your control is halved in each hand. Better to be very good with one." He pointed to the middle of the garden. "Both of you here, I want to see how you move, not spells, just movement. Where you stand, how you watch each other when you shift your weight." What followed was technically not a fight. It was 2 children walking around each other in a muddy garden while a man who'd been trained by some of the most skilled auras of his generation watched and occasionally said things like, "There. That's the problem, you turned your back, or Harry, stop looking at her hands, look at her feet. Feet tell you where someone's going before hands do." But it had the structure of something real in it. By the end of the morning, Harry could hold a defensive stance without thinking about it, and Hermione had identified on her own that Harry had a habit of dropping his left shoulder before he committed to a rightward movement. "That's a tell," she told him. "I know," he said, annoyed. "Don't be annoyed, fix it." He fixed it by the following week, which was faster than Sirius expected, and Sirius mentioned this to Amelia, who said, "Yes, that's consistent," and kept reading her files. Amelia taught them law, not in a formal sense, not sitting them down with ministry textbooks, though those appeared in the house library by the time Hermione was 10 and Harry 8, but in the way she talked about her work, the way she handled problems in front of them rather than around them, the way she never pretended the ministry was something it wasn't. "The Wisengamot convicted a man this week," she told them one evening over dinner. Harry was 7, Hermione 11, nearly 12. "Sentenced him to 2 years in Azkaban for illegal wand use. He was defending his home against a break-in." Remus passed the potatoes. "What was the complication?" "He's Muggle-born," Amelia said. "The man who broke in isn't." The magical law enforcement patrol that responded filed the report in a way that inverted the sequence of events, not obviously carefully. Hermione's fork stopped moving. "They lied in the report. They wrote what they wrote," Amelia said. "What they wrote, if you read it in isolation, sounds like a correct account. If you read it alongside the timeline established by the witness statements of the neighbors, 2 of whom were Muggle and therefore didn't have their memories modified before anyone thought to do it, a different picture emerges." "What are you going to do?" Harry asked. "File a formal review request, get the neighbor testimonies into evidence, submit my own analysis of the timeline discrepancy to the chief warlock." She ate her dinner. "It will take 6 to 8 months, and the man will serve some of that sentence before we can get him out. That is the cost of the process being what it is." "That's wrong," Harry said, flat and certain. "It is," Amelia agreed, "which is why we're going to change it, slowly, correctly, in ways that stick. Because if you change it fast and wrong, someone worse comes along and changes it back, and the next person who needs the process has less protection than this one." Silence. Then Hermione said, "The neighbor testimonies, they're Muggle, so they're not bound by wizarding secrecy restrictions in an evidentiary sense." Amelia looked at her. "Technically, under Section 7 of the Magical Evidence Act of 1912, Muggle witness statements are admissible in Wisengamot proceedings when they concern observable non-magical aspects of an event. The patrol overlooked that provision." "They didn't overlook it," Hermione said. "They assumed you would." A beat. Then Amelia smiled, the particular smile she had that meant someone had said exactly the right thing, and said, "Yes, exactly, that's exactly right." Harry watched this exchange with the attentiveness he brought to everything interesting. He didn't say anything else, but she could see him filing it away, the same way he filed away Sirius's lessons about footwork and Remus's observations about people, building a picture of how the world actually worked underneath the surface of how it claimed to work. Remus taught them everything else, history and the parts of history that had been quietly edited out of the standard book of spells and the Hogwarts curriculum, magical theory, which he found genuinely interesting and which therefore came alive in the telling, magical creatures, which he knew with the particular intimacy of someone who was himself one. The actual mechanics of why certain spells worked and others didn't, why magical ability distributed unevenly, why some children showed magic early and others not until they were at Hogwarts. He also, quietly and without ever making it a lesson with a capital L, taught them what his life looked like. They knew about the lycanthropy early. Amelia had decided that children living with a werewolf should understand what that meant, and that understanding it would serve them better than being protected from it. Remus had been present for this conversation and had been, briefly, very still. Amelia had then looked at him and said, "Tell them yourself if you'd prefer, in whatever terms feel right to you." He had. Harry, who was 5 at the time, had listened to the whole explanation and then said, "Does it hurt?" "Yes," Remus said, "very much. Every month, every full moon, yes." Harry was quiet for a moment. "Then can we leave the light on downstairs so it's not dark when you come back?" Remus had had to look away for a moment. When he looked back, his voice was entirely steady. "I'd like that, yes." They always left the light on after that, and they never forgot once, and they never made it into something larger than it was, which was the kindest possible way they could have handled it. When Harry was 7, he started leaving a blanket on the kitchen chair nearest the window, because he'd noticed Remus was always cold afterward, and the kitchen chair was where Remus always sat first when he came in. Hermione, independently, had started leaving a thermos of tea by the same chair. Remus drank the tea under the blanket and read whatever book Hermione had left alongside it, and felt, in a way that was almost impossible to articulate, that this particular household had decided he was worth the consideration. This was not a small thing for someone who had spent a decade being treated as something between a problem and a liability. He tutored them both with the attention each of them needed, which were very different attentions. Hermione needed depth, needed him to come at things from unexpected angles because she'd usually already absorbed the straightforward approach, needed to be shown where the edges of her knowledge were so she could be interested in them rather than afraid of them. She had, when she first arrived, a perfectionism so brittle it was almost painful to watch. The absolute need to be right, to not be caught not knowing, which he recognized as the particular armor of a child who'd felt unsafe. He worked at it gently, by being wrong himself sometimes in front of her and being cheerful about it, by framing mistakes as information. It took 2 years before she could say "I don't know yet" without going tense around the eyes. After that she said it all the time, with a relish that suggested she'd been saving up. Harry needed something different. He didn't lack confidence or curiosity. What he lacked, initially, was the patience to let understanding build at its own speed. He wanted to do things, to try them, to feel them work. The theory was an obstacle between him and the practice. Remus learned to give him the practice first and build the theory underneath it afterward, because the doing opened something in Harry that made the why suddenly interesting. Harry also had an intuitive grasp of magical mechanics that occasionally startled Remus, connections drawn sideways across subject areas that shouldn't have been accessible to a child of his age, as if his understanding of magic was fundamentally three-dimensional when most people's was flat. He mentioned this to Sirius once, after a lesson where Harry had spontaneously linked a principle of transfiguration theory to something in the nature of protective charms, and arrived at a conclusion that was, as far as Remus could determine, correct and also not in any book in the house. "He's James's son," Sirius said simply. "James was brilliant, but this is different," Remus said. "James knew the rules perfectly. Harry seems to know the thing underneath the rules." Sirius was quiet for a moment. "Lily," he said finally, "that's Lily." The summer Harry was 9 and Hermione 13 was the summer Sirius started teaching them wandless magic in earnest. Not because it was on any curriculum, it wasn't. Hogwarts barely touched it as a topic. Most of the academic establishment considered it an edge case or a parlor trick or a sign of instability, depending on who you asked. But Sirius had been thinking about what he'd said in the garden 3 years ago about going home, about everything you have, and he'd gone to Amelia with it, and she'd looked at him over her monocle and said, "I assume you have a training plan and not just an impulse." "I have a training plan and an impulse," he said. "Write up the plan. If it's reasonable, we'll discuss it." It was, in fact, a very good plan. She approved it in a week. The wandless work built on what Harry and Hermione had been doing since Harry was 4, since the grape on the kitchen floor, since Hermione had explained directed intention to a toddler. Harry took to it with an almost physical pleasure, the way athletes look when they finally understand what their body was already doing. He was performing reliable wandless lumos by the end of the first month, which was not supposed to be possible for a 9-year-old, and Sirius wrote this down carefully and said nothing to anyone outside the household. Hermione was more precise than Harry but less instinctive. She could perform wandless spells with beautiful accuracy once she'd worked through the theoretical mechanics, but she was slower to start. This frustrated her exactly once, for approximately 4 days, and then she reframed it. Remus could see the moment she decided that precision was actually a more useful long-term skill than raw instinct, and began working with her own particular strengths rather than against them. After that she got very good very quickly, in the way Hermione Granger always got good at things she decided to care about. What neither of them had yet was control under pressure. That was the gap Sirius was designing for. He started stress-testing their wandless focus. Loud noises, unexpected distractions, problems thrown at them mid-exercise. He and Remus would occasionally have a very loud argument in the next room during practice to see if it broke concentration. Harry found this funnier than was professionally ideal. Hermione found it annoying, which produced exactly the right kind of controlled irritation to practice through. "She's going to be terrifying," Sirius told Remus one evening. "She already is," Remus said, "more terrifying." "Yes, and Harry," Remus considered this. The lamp was lit and Harry was at the kitchen table doing the magical theory homework Remus had set, and he had ink on his cheek and was frowning at the page with total absorption, and outside the window the Yorkshire evening was going dark and blue. "I think Harry is going to be the kind of person that things turn on. Critical moments, he'll be at the center of things." He paused. "I want to make sure he's ready for that." Sirius was quiet. They both knew what things had already turned on Harry at 13 months old in a house in Godric's Hollow. "He knows about his parents. He knows what he needs to know at 9, Remus said. "We'll tell him more when he's ready for more." He looked at his tea. "He asked me last month what my patronus looks like." "What did you say?" "I showed him." Sirius glanced at him sideways. Remus's patronus was a wolf, silver and enormous, and Sirius had always thought it was one of the most beautiful things he'd ever seen, this great luminous creature that Remus contained inside himself alongside everything else the wolf meant to him. "How did he take it?" "He said it was brilliant," Remus said. "Then he said he wanted to learn the charm." "He's 9. I know." Remus allowed himself a small smile. "I started teaching him the theory anyway." The letters arrived on Harry's 11th birthday. He was awake before dawn, which was not unusual. Harry had always been an early riser in the way that suggested his internal clock ran on a different time than everyone else's, and he was sitting on the garden wall watching the sun come up when the owls came. His own, which Sirius had given him for his birthday with great ceremony, brought the Hogwarts letter. A ministry owl brought Hermione's because she was 13 and had been waiting 2 years for this particular formality to be resolved. Harry read his letter in the early morning quiet, then he went inside and put it on the kitchen table and waited. Sirius came down first, already dressed, hair still chaotic. He picked up the letter, read it, and grinned with a sudden, complete joy that was one of the best things about him when it happened. "There it is," he said. "There it bloody is." "Don't swear," Amelia said, coming in behind him, which was an absolute fiction because Amelia's relationship with profanity in private was entirely pragmatic. "You're going to Hogwarts," Sirius told Harry, ignoring this. "The same school where your dad and I set a record for detention that stood for 15 years. "Did it?" Harry said with an expression of absolute delight. "Don't," Amelia said. "The record is there to be broken," Sirius said. "Sirius." "I'm just saying." Remus walked in, assessed the conversation, and sat down with his tea. "The detention record was broken in 1989 by a pair of Hufflepuff twins," he said. "So that particular motivation is off the table." Sirius looked genuinely devastated. "I hadn't heard that." "I know, I didn't tell you on purpose." Hermione came downstairs with her letter open and was already reading it for what was clearly the second time. She had her scholarship to the Ministry Accelerated program, which was for magically gifted students who wanted educational pathways outside Hogwarts, and she'd been going back and forth on it for months. She sat down across from Harry, looked at him, looked at her letter. "Well," he said, "I'm coming to Hogwarts," she said. "Obviously, someone has to keep you from blowing up the dungeons." "I've only blown up windows," Harry said, injured. "Yet." "Language choices like yet are why people find you alarming," Harry told her. She smiled at that, the quick, bright one that she saved for when something genuinely pleased her. "Good." They spent the day in Diagon Alley, all 5 of them, Amelia in her ministry robes because she'd come from a morning meeting and hadn't stopped home first. Sirius causing a minor scene in quality Quidditch supplies that resulted in 3 separate staff members recognizing him and wanting to discuss the 1978 Gryffindor season. Remus spending 20 minutes in flourish and blots, and coming out looking genuinely happy in the particular way he reserved for bookshops. Ollivander's was the last stop. Harry went in while the others waited outside because Sirius had strong feelings about the sanctity of the wand-choosing experience, and he was in there for 40 minutes. When he came out, he was holding a wand of holly and phoenix feather 11 inches, and he had an expression on his face that was hard to describe, not surprise exactly, more like recognition. "Well," Sirius said. Harry turned the wand over in his hands. He said it was unusual. That he'd sold the matching wand, same core, same phoenix, a long time ago. He looked up, his eyes were steady. He said the phoenix that gave the feathers only ever gave 2. Nobody said anything for a moment. Sirius crouched down so they were at the same level, which he did sometimes when something was important, and he looked at Harry directly. "You know what that means? That Voldemort's wand and my wand share a core," Harry said. "Yeah," he paused. "Ollivander told me." He seemed to think I'd be frightened. "Are you?" Harry considered this with the same serious thoroughness he brought to everything worth thinking about. "No," he said. "He used his wand and it didn't work on me. Seems like I got the better end of that particular pairing." Sirius looked at him for a long moment and then stood up and put his hand on Harry's shoulder. "You're James's son," he said, "and Lily's, and you're mine in the way that counts. Don't forget any of that." Harry nodded, and the wand caught the afternoon light, and Hermione stepped up beside him and said, "Right, can we get ice cream? Remus promised ages ago." "I said perhaps," Remus said. Same thing, Harry and Hermione said together without looking at each other, in the particular synchronized way they developed that Sirius found mildly eerie and Amelia found quietly satisfying as evidence that the household had worked. The night before they left for Hogwarts, Harry found Sirius in the back garden. He was sitting on the garden wall, Harry's spot generally, but Sirius had colonized it for the evening, looking up at the stars with a beer balanced on his knee and the sort of expression he got when he was thinking about things he didn't usually talk about. Harry sat next to him. Neither of them said anything for a while. "I'm going to be fine," Harry said eventually. "I know," Sirius said. "You were going to say something about being careful." "I was going to say something about being careful," Sirius agreed. "But you're right, so I won't." Silence. The stars were very bright. "Tell me about my dad," Harry said. "At Hogwarts, the beginning." So Sirius talked. He talked about the train on September 1st, 1971, about the compartment he'd found James in, about a skinny kid with ink on his fingers and a chocolate frog in each hand and more confidence than a 12-year-old had any right to. He talked about the first week and the second week, and the Marauders coming together not all at once, but in the way real things form, gradually and then suddenly. Remus last because Remus was always careful with trust. He talked about James's first Quidditch match and the way their dorm smelled like burnt caramel for 3 weeks after a transfiguration accident, and the night the four of them discovered the passage behind the mirror on the 4th floor. Harry listened to all of it with his eyes on the stars and his hands around his knees. When Sirius stopped, Harry was quiet for a long time. Then, "I'm going to make my own ones, my own moments, not repeat his." "Obviously," Sirius said. "That's the right answer, but it's good to know what his were." "Yes," Sirius said. "It's very good to know." They stayed until Amelia called them in, her voice carrying from the kitchen window with the particular authority of someone who had a 5:45 train to catch in the morning and was not going to be delayed by sentiment, however valid. They went in and the light was on in every window, and downstairs Hermione was still awake reading and Remus had made tea, and it was the last night the house would be this full for a while, and all of them knew it, and none of them said it because there was no need. Some things don't need saying, they just need to be true. Chapter 3, First Year Unfiltered. The Hogwarts Express left at 11, and Harry was on it by 10:40, which was early by the standards of the family. Sirius operated on a principle that anything less than 5 minutes late was practically punctual, but Harry had wanted the time. He stood in the corridor while the platform filled up around him, watching families say goodbye through the window, and he thought about the night before and Sirius talking about his father and the particular specific gravity of going somewhere that meant something before you'd even arrived. Hermione found him at 10:43 with a trunk that was, by any reasonable metric, too heavy for a 13-year-old to have managed alone, and that she had clearly managed alone anyway through a combination of determination and strategic use of the trolley's momentum. "You could have waited," Harry said. "I could have waited for you to come help me," she said, "but then I would have had to wait and the compartments at the far end fill up first." She settled her trunk with an air of completion. "I've already found us a good one, come on." He followed her down the train to a compartment near the middle, not the far end. He'd learned that Hermione's stated reasoning and her actual reasoning were sometimes different, and the actual reason for this compartment was, he suspected, the window angle, which gave a clear view of the corridor in both directions. She had, growing up with Amelia Bones, developed a habit of situational awareness that she would never describe that way, but which expressed itself in things like always knowing where the exits were and never sitting with her back to a door. They had the compartment to themselves for about 20 minutes. Then a red-haired boy looked in through the glass, hesitated, and said, "Sorry, is it all right? Everywhere else is pretty full." "Come in," Hermione said, already back in her book. The boy came in with a second-hand trunk and an owl in a cage and the look of someone from a large family, which Harry had learned to recognize from the particular ease with which he arranged his things around other people's without needing to be told. He had a smear of something on his nose that might have been soot. "Ron Weasley," he said, dropping into the seat across from Harry. "Harry Potter." Ron's eyes went to the scar the way everyone's did, and then, which Harry appreciated, went back to his face almost immediately. "Right, yeah, knew you'd be on here somewhere." He seemed to decide that was enough about that. "Hooray you, Hermione Granger." She didn't look up from her book. "3rd year. Oh, Ron took this in. Bit early to be on the train. I'm accompanying Harry," she said, turning a page. "We live together." "Oh," Ron said again, recalibrating. He looked at Harry. "She always like this? Worse when she's interested in you," Harry said. "This is actually quite restrained." Hermione turned another page. "I can hear you." "I know," Harry said. Ron Weasley, Harry decided, had good instincts. He grinned at the exchange like someone who recognized the specific texture of sibling interaction and found it familiar. "6 brothers and sisters," he said, unprompted, in explanation of the recognition. "Well, 5 brothers and a sister. Fred and George are 4th years. Bill's already out. Charlie too. Percy's a prefect." He said this last part with a tone that suggested complex feelings about it. "What house do you think you'll be in?" Harry asked. "Gryffindor. All my family are. You?" Harry had thought about this. He'd thought about it quite a lot because Amelia was Hufflepuff, had been fiercely, and still maintained that Hufflepuff's underestimation was the Ministry's greatest institutional failure, and Sirius and James had been Gryffindor, and Remus had been Gryffindor, and he'd absorbed all of it and arrived at the conclusion that the hat would put him where he was supposed to go and that fighting it was the wrong approach. "Don't know," he said honestly. "I'll let the hat decide." Ron seemed to find this refreshingly straightforward. They talked for an hour. Ron knew an enormous amount about Quidditch and almost nothing about magical theory, which was approximately the inverse of what Hermione knew, and Harry sat between them and served as a translator of sorts when Ron said something like, "Obviously the Chudley Cannon's formation strategy is the reason they lost the '89 season," and Hermione looked up with the expression that meant, "I have no idea what you just said and I'm deciding whether to care." "Do you play?" Harry asked Ron. "In the garden, yeah. Mum won't let us try out until second year school rules, but we've been flying since we could walk basically." He glanced at Harry. "You, since I was 3, Harry said. "Sirius taught me." "Who's Sirius?" "My godfather, Sirius Black." Ron's expression went through approximately 4 stages in rapid succession: recognition, surprise, the recalibration of several assumptions, and finally a kind of impressed respect. "Sirius Black, who was a Gryffindor chaser in '78, same one. My brothers talked about him, said he was the best natural flyer in a generation." Ron looked at Harry with new attention. "Can you actually fly?" "A bit," Harry said, which was what Remus had taught him to say when the honest answer was yes, considerably better than most adults I've met. The Sorting Hat spent a long time on Harry's head. He sat on the stool in the great hall with the whole school watching and the hat pulled over his eyes, and he could feel it thinking, feel the edges of something curious pressing gently at his mind. Then a voice, dry and thoughtful, said inside his skull, "Well, this is unusual, is it?" Harry thought back. "You have the markings of several houses. Gryffindor's courage, yes, obvious, but there's something underneath, a mind like Ravenclaw's, and a loyalty specific, fierce, not general, that's Hufflepuff. And ambition, not for power but for outcome. You want to see things through, that's Slytherin at its best. So where do I go? Where do you want to go?" Harry considered it honestly. He thought about Amelia saying, "I've been taking things on since I was 22. He thought about Sirius teaching him footwork in the garden. He thought about Remus being wrong sometimes on purpose so Hermione could learn to be comfortable not knowing. He thought about the people who had chosen deliberately to be brave in the long sustained way that wasn't dramatic, just consistent. "Gryffindor," the hat said, apparently having read all of this. "If you're certain." "I'm not certain of anything," Harry said, "but I'll work with it." "Gryffindor." The hat called and the table erupted, and Harry walked over and found Ron Weasley already there, grinning, and sat down and looked across to the Ravenclaw table where Hermione gave him a small nod that meant good, that's the correct result, which was exactly what he'd expected from her. He caught from the staff table Professor Dumbledore watching him with an expression that was thoughtful and something else, something that looked, Harry thought, like the careful reassessment of a variable. Harry met his eyes directly and held them for a moment before looking away, because Sirius had told him long ago that you looked away from powerful people when you chose to, not when they made you. The defense against the dark arts professor was a man named Quirinus Quirrell, who wore a purple turban and smelled of garlic, and had a stutter that came and went in a way Harry found inconsistent. He sat through the first defense class watching Quirrell teach a lesson about vampires that was technically accurate and practically useless, and thought about what Sirius had said once about people who knew the theory of something but not the reality. Quirrell knew the theory. He knew it the way someone learned from a textbook without ever having stood in a room with the thing they were describing. Something else nagged at him. Not the stutter that could be nerves, could be genuine. He wasn't going to dismiss it out of hand. It was the smell. He knew from Remus that certain dark magic left traces, residue in the practitioner, detectable to someone sensitive if they knew what to look for. He wasn't a specialist. He hadn't expected to need to be in the first week of school. He wrote to Remus that evening. "Professor of Dada smells wrong," not a complaint about the teaching, though that's also an issue. "Something underneath the garlic. Is there a detection charm for dark magic residue in a person?" Remus's reply came by return owl. "Yes, don't use it in class. Come home for the first Hogsmeade weekend and I'll show you properly. Also follow up on the wrong smell. What specifically? Like something else is living in the smell. 2 separate layers, a pause of 24 hours, and then be careful. Don't confront anything. Observe and write." Harry observed. He went to Quirrell's classes and took notes on the actual lesson and separate notes on Quirrell, the inconsistent stutter, the way he never turned his back fully to the class, the turban he adjusted twice per lesson with his left hand in a gesture that looked involuntary, the occasional moment where his eyes went distant and something moved behind them that wasn't Quirrell. By the 3rd week he had 4 pages of observations. He showed them to Hermione, who read them twice and then said very quietly, "Do you think he's possessed?" "I think something's living in him," Harry said. "Whether it's possession or something else, I don't know yet." "Who do we tell?" This was the question. Dumbledore was the obvious answer, the headmaster, the most powerful wizard in Britain, the authority structure of the school. But Harry had grown up in a household where Amelia Bones had taught him that institutional authority and correct action were not always the same thing, and where Sirius had taught him that going up the chain of command was appropriate when the chain was trustworthy, and where Remus had taught him to observe before he acted. He didn't know yet whether Dumbledore was aware of what was wrong with Quirrell and doing something about it, or unaware, or something else. "We tell Sirius first," Harry said. "He'll know who to take it to. Or we gather more information," Hermione said. "There's also the question of what Quirrell wants or what's using him." She paused. "There's something in this school he's after. You can see it in how he moves. He's looking for something." "The stone," Harry said. She looked at him sharply. "I overheard something on the third floor, two teachers talking." He'd been where he shouldn't have been, technically, but he'd learned at 4 years old that being where you shouldn't sometimes got you information you needed. "There's something being kept here, something from Gringotts. I don't know what it is yet." Hermione's eyes went determined in the way that meant a library problem was incoming. "I'll find it," she said, which was not a boast but simply an accurate description of her intentions. It took her 4 days. "The Philosopher's Stone," she told him in the Hogwarts library on a Thursday evening, speaking quietly under silencing charm. She'd learned that last year, very useful. "Nicola's flame produces the elixir of life. If Voldemort is in some form still alive, and if he's using Quirrell," she laid out the logic in a single clean sequence, and it was tight and Harry couldn't find a gap in it. "Right," he said. "So what do? We figure out what's keeping the stone safe right now. Then we figure out whether Quirrell can get through it. Then we decide whether we need to act or whether Dumbledore already has a plan." He looked at her steadily. "We're not charging in without information." Hermione looked faintly relieved that he'd said this. She'd been watching him, he thought, to see if the Gryffindor urgency was going to override the household's training. "Good," she said, "because going in without information is how people get killed." "Amelia in our heads," Harry said. "Permanently," Hermione agreed. They spent October and November working the problem the way they'd been taught to work problems, which was from multiple angles simultaneously, never putting all the weight on one approach. Hermione identified the protection mechanisms through cross-referencing what she could observe with what she knew about the professors and their specialties. Fluffy, the three-headed dog on the third floor, which Harry had accidentally discovered in September and which he thought was magnificent, was Hagrid's contribution. The Devil's Snare below was Professor Sprout's. A logic puzzle with potions bore Snape's precise signature. An enchanted chess set of terrifying quality suggested McGonagall. A troll dealt with in November in a way that Harry thought was a bit crude but effective, and then something else, something Harry hadn't determined yet. The troll had been, in retrospect, useful. It had come in on Halloween, fully grown, wandering the dungeons, and Hermione had been alone in the girls' bathroom when it arrived, and Harry had found this out second-hand in a corridor at a dead run. He'd gotten there in time. Technically, he'd gotten there after Hermione had already knocked the troll off balance with a conjured jet of water directed at the ceiling, so it came down on the troll's head, which was the kind of solution only available to someone who'd been doing directed intention exercises since she was 9. But the point was they'd both been in the room when McGonagall arrived. And the way the story got told afterward made it sound like Harry and Hermione had arrived together and worked the problem together, which was almost true. McGonagall gave them both a detention and 20 points to their respective houses and looked at them with an expression Harry couldn't entirely read. Ron Weasley, who had been there, said afterward, "She usually takes more points than that." "She gave them back too," Harry said. "Net positive." Ron absorbed this. "Hermione, that thing with the water, standard redirection principle," Hermione said. "The troll's center of mass was high. It was always going to fall toward its own momentum." "Right," Ron said in the tone of someone deciding to accept information without fully understanding it. He'd been doing this with increasing frequency. It was, Harry thought, one of Ron's most useful qualities. He was never too proud to defer to expertise in areas outside his own. The Christmas holidays were quiet. Most students went home. Harry and Hermione went back to Yorkshire because Yorkshire was home, and they arrived off the Hogwarts Express into a platform where Sirius was already there, leaning against a pillar with his hands in his coat pockets and his hair doing something dramatic in the December wind, and the look on his face when he saw them was the same look he'd had that day in the garden, the one that was still, years later, not entirely used to the fact of them existing and being fine. Remus was in the car. He'd stayed home because the moon had been 2 days ago and he was still moving carefully, and he'd brought thermoses of tea and a paper bag of the bakery pastries that Hermione liked. "Report," Sirius said in the car, because this was how they did it, had always done it, come home and tell the household what was happening, not edited, not managed, just the information. Harry told them about Quirrell first, then about the stone. Then about the protection mechanisms and the sequence of chambers and what they'd worked out about what it would take to get through. By the time he finished, the car was quiet. Remus was looking out the window with his thinking expression. Amelia, who they'd picked up on the way, was very still in the front seat. "You didn't go in," Sirius said. "We didn't have enough information to go in," Harry said. "And Dumbledore might already have a plan, we don't know." Sirius turned around to look at him and Hermione both. His expression was the particular one that meant he was proud but was trying not to be obvious about it because he thought obvious pride made children cocky. It was not a very good disguise. "Good thinking," he said. "Both of you. What are we doing about Quirrell?" Hermione asked. Amelia spoke without turning around. "I'm going to have a conversation with Albus Dumbledore," she said. "Not because I believe he's unaware. I believe he's running a strategy and I want to understand it before I decide whether I agree with it. And if you don't agree with it, Harry asked, then I'll tell him that, she said. Clearly, she met with Dumbledore between Christmas and New Year's. She came back from that meeting with the particular expression of someone who had learned something that confirmed a suspicion and found the confirmation more frustrating than comforting. He knows, she told Sirius and Remus that evening, the children technically in bed and therefore entirely present behind the kitchen door, which everyone in the household pretended not to know. He's using the stone as bait. He believes Quirrell or whatever is using Quirrell will come for it, and he believes that when it does, the protections will prevent it from succeeding. Does he know the children have mapped the protections? Sirius said. I told him. A pause. He was surprised. And then he was not surprised, which is the particular Dumbledore response that means he's filed the information and is already thinking about what it means for his strategy. I don't like it, Sirius said flatly. I don't like it either, Amelia said, but I understand it. If Voldemort is genuinely alive, if this is what I think it is, then Dumbledore is trying to get a controlled confrontation on his terms rather than an unpredictable one. The logic is sound. She paused again. The risk is that children are in the building where the controlled confrontation is going to happen. What did he say about that? He said they're safer under his observation than anywhere else. Her voice was flat in a way that meant she was containing something. He also said that Harry in particular has a protection that makes him uniquely resistant to Voldemort's power. The blood protection, Remus said. Something more specific than that, something that happened in Godric's Hollow. She paused. He wouldn't explain further, which means either he doesn't know the mechanism or he's decided not to tell me, and I can't determine which. Behind the kitchen door, Harry sat with his back against the wall and his knees up, and listened to the people who loved him trying to figure out how to protect him, and felt the particular complicated weight of knowing things about yourself that you only knew secondhand, through other people's understanding. His mother had done something with her death that made him resistant to Voldemort. He'd known the outline of this for years. He didn't know, any more than Amelia did, the precise mechanism. He thought about it for a while. Then he thought about what mattered right now, which was that something was in Quirrell's head and it wanted the stone, and the protection mechanism was real but not infallible, and he and Hermione had already done most of the analytical work, and if the moment came, they would not be going in blind. He went back to bed and slept well, which Sirius took as evidence of either courage or insufficient imagination, and which Harry could have told him was just the practical result of having done the preparation and trusting the work. The moment came in June, not where Harry had expected it. He'd been watching Quirrell for months, watching the turban, watching the inconsistent stutter, watching the way Voldemort, because by April he'd accepted that's what it was, moved through Quirrell like a tide moving through a vessel, sometimes present and sometimes not. Quirrell had been probing the defenses, Harry and Hermione had tracked the probe attempts through their own observations, and through some fairly creative application of detection charms that Remus had taught Harry over Easter. When Quirrell moved for the stone on a Tuesday in June, Harry knew approximately 20 minutes before it happened. He developed, over the course of the year, a sensitivity to the dark magic residue that he'd first noticed as a smell in September. It was more specific now. He could feel it when it moved, when it activated, the way you can feel a change in air pressure before weather comes. He was in the Gryffindor common room when he felt it shift and sharpen, and he was out the portrait hole 30 seconds later. Hermione met him in the corridor outside the charms classroom because she'd been keeping her own observations and had drawn the same conclusion on a slightly different timeline. You felt it too, he said. I had a different indicator, she said. The chess set on the 5th level, I charmed one of the pieces in September with a proximity alert, very low key, shouldn't have tripped anything, it just triggered. They looked at each other. We go in together, Harry said. Not heroics, we work the chambers, get to the stone before he does, or stop him in the chambers if we can. Dumbledore, if we have time to send for him we will, right now we don't. He looked at her directly. You don't have to, don't finish that sentence, she said. Let's go. The first chamber, Fluffy, was already dealt with. Quirrell had used a sleeping charm on the dog, harp still playing. Harry stopped the harp and let Fluffy wake up enough to be a problem for anything coming back through before dropping down the trapdoor after Hermione. The Devil's Snare recognized Harry. He thought it was something to do with his particular magical signature, that the plant was enchanted to allow specific people through, or perhaps Hermione's confident non-fear response to it simply bypassed the threat assessment. They moved through it quickly and without drama. The winged keys were Harry's, obviously. He was airborne before Hermione had registered the broom rack, and he had the right key in under 2 minutes because he'd been flying for 8 years and had Sirius Black's taxonomic approach to aerial targeting ingrained so deep it was reflex. He tossed it to Hermione, who caught it without looking and had the door open. The chess set was the problem. It was McGonagall's work and it was brilliant, and it expected sacrifice in a way that assumed the player valued their pieces less than their objective. Hermione sat down at the board and they talked through it in low voices quickly, and she found the line. There was always a line. She'd been playing chess against Remus since she was 9, and he was a vicious chess player who had never once let her win, but the line required one of them to put themselves in danger. "I'll do it," Harry said. "You're better in the final chamber than I am," Hermione said, already moving her piece. "This is the correct allocation of risk." He opened his mouth. "Harry," she said, and her voice was even, "I know what I'm doing. Go, I'll follow when it clears." He went. The potion logic puzzle was Snape's, and it was genuinely clever. Most people would have panicked. Harry didn't panic. He read the riddle twice, identified the smallest bottle as the forward potion and the round bottle as the return, and pocketed the round bottle for Hermione. He went through. The Mirror of Erist was in the final chamber, and Quirrell was standing before it with his back to the door, and for a moment Harry stood in the doorway and saw the situation clearly. The mirror, the man, the turban, the thing that was living in both of them. "I wondered when you'd come," Quirrell said, still looking at the mirror. His voice was entirely without stutter. "You've been watching me all year." "Yes," Harry said. He walked into the room. There was no point in pretending otherwise. The stones in the mirror. Quirrell turned. His eyes were strange, very wide, lit by something that wasn't him. "Tell me how to get it." Harry looked at the mirror. He understood it. Remus had told him about it years ago, something Dumbledore had once described to him about desire and reflection and what you truly wanted. He walked to it and looked at himself, and what he saw was himself, exactly as he was, standing exactly where he was, and in the reflection's hand was a small red stone. He felt it drop into his pocket. "I see myself shaking your hand," Harry said evenly. "I think that tells us both something about how this ends." Quirrell's face did something that wasn't Quirrell anymore. "You are a child," Voldemort said through Quirrell's mouth, and the voice was wrong in ways that were deeply biological, like hearing something that the body knew to fear before the mind caught up. "I am," Harry agreed. "And you're half a person in someone else's head." He kept his hands loose. He was not afraid, or more precisely, the fear was present and managed, the same way the full moon was present and managed. It was information, not instruction. "I'm going to walk out of here with the stone. You can try to stop me." Quirrell lunged. What followed was not a formal duel. It was exactly what Sirius had described in the garden 5 years ago: no rules, going home. Quirrell was fast, and the thing driving him was genuinely powerful. But Harry had spent his entire childhood being trained by 3 people who had all survived an actual war, and his wandless work was good enough to shield without breaking his stride, and the stone stayed in his pocket. He felt the burning where Quirrell's hands connected once, the man grabbing at his wrist, and the burning went both ways, Harry's skin blistering and Quirrell's hand going to ash, and he understood suddenly, viscerally, what his mother had done and what it cost. He pulled free. Quirrell collapsed. The thing that was Voldemort shrieked past him. He felt it like a sudden cold, like falling, and then it was gone, and there was only Quirrell crumpling and Harry standing over him with his wrist burned and the stone in his pocket and the whole quiet chamber around them. He was unconscious before Dumbledore arrived. He was told later that Hermione had come through the chest chamber 11 minutes after him, found the aftermath, and immediately sent a Patronus, a silver otter, which surprised people though it shouldn't have, to both Dumbledore and Amelia Bones simultaneously. He woke in the hospital wing to Sirius sitting beside him with absolutely no expression on his face, which was worse than any expression would have been. "Wrist is fine," Harry said preemptively. "Hermione's okay." "Hermione's fine. She's been here twice already and has left you a list of things you did incorrectly that she wants to discuss when you're conscious." Sirius paused. "She also left you a book." "Of course she did." Another pause. The no expression was still happening. "Harry, I had the information," Harry said. "I had the training. Hermione was behind me. The alternative was leaving the stone for Quirrell to take." He met Sirius's eyes directly. "I didn't do anything you didn't teach me to do." Sirius looked at him for a long time. "I know," he said finally. "That's the problem." Harry almost smiled. "The stone's safe. Quirrell is." He stopped. He'd been trying not to think about Quirrell, about what happened to people who carried something like that. "Voldemort didn't get a body." "No," Sirius said. "He didn't. He'll try again." "Yes, we'll be ready." Sirius looked at him, his godson, James's son, Lily's, his, and something moved through his expression that was complex and old and had to do with a war that wasn't over. Then he said, "Yeah, we will." Amelia arrived an hour later with Remus, and the way she looked at Harry when she came in was not the face she showed the Ministry or the Wisengamot or anyone who needed to believe she was completely unmoved by events. It was the other face, the one the household knew, the one that existed in the kitchen in the evenings, the one that had sat next to a 9-year-old girl in a hospital and said, "You'll come with me." She sat down and took his hand, the unbandaged one, and didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "You protected the stone, you protected Hermione, you contained Voldemort without being contained yourself." She paused. "And next time we'll have a better system for communication so you don't go in with a 12-minute information gap." 13, Remus said from the doorway. 13, she corrected without letting go of Harry's hand. "We'll fix it." "Right," Harry said. Outside the hospital wing, Hogwarts was settling into the quiet of a June evening, and somewhere in the castle the year was drawing to a close, and across the school Harry Potter was becoming, quietly and without his permission, something people talked about. He didn't care much about that. He cared about the stone being safe, and Hermione being fine, and Voldemort being gone for now, and the fact that when he'd stood in that chamber and looked in the mirror, the deepest desire of his heart had been exactly what he already had, which meant he thought that he had everything he needed. Chapter 4. The Chamber. Gilderoy Lockhart arrived at Hogwarts on September 1st with 7 trunks, a personal photographer, and the absolute conviction that the most interesting thing in any room was himself. Harry watched him at the start of term feast from the Gryffindor table and said nothing for approximately 4 minutes, which was longer than Sirius had managed when Harry wrote about the new defense appointment over the summer. Lockhart. Sirius had written back, in a letter that Remus had clearly tried to moderate and partially failed. Gilderoy Lockhart, the man who wrote a book about a werewolf attack in which, notably, the werewolf descriptions are anatomically impossible, the defensive magic described doesn't exist in the form he claims, and the whole thing reads like someone who interviewed the actual survivor and then inserted himself as the protagonist. I know this because Remus read it and laughed for 3 minutes straight, which is the longest I've ever heard him laugh at anything. Remus had added at the bottom in his own hand, the Cornish pixie incident he describes on page 47 of Magical Me is also fabricated. The specific charm he claims to have used was invented 6 years after the date he gives for the event. Be polite. Observe. Harry had been observing for exactly 4 minutes and had concluded that Sirius was correct, Remus was correct, and that Lockhart was either the most self-deluded man alive or the most calculated, and he wasn't sure which was worse. He leaned to Ron. He's a fraud. Ron, who had been watching Lockhart sign an autograph for a second year across the table, said, "Yeah, obviously, question is what kind." Harry looked at him. Ron had developed over a year of friendship a pleasantly direct analytical streak that occasionally surprised people who'd written him off as straightforwardly unintellectual. He was not academic in Hermione's way. He thought through action and pattern rather than text and theory, but he wasn't wrong. "I'll ask Hermione," Harry said. "She's already got a theory," Ron said. "She had it before pudding." Harry looked up to the Ravenclaw table. Hermione was watching Lockhart with the focused attention she normally reserved for a particularly interesting problem, and she had her quill out and was writing something on her napkin. She caught Harry's eye and gave a small nod that meant later, "I'll explain later." He turned back to his dinner and ate, and across the table Lockhart was laughing at something he'd said himself, which Harry noted as data point 1. The defense class confirmed it within 15 minutes. Lockhart released a cage of Cornish pixies, small, chaotic, and entirely unimpressed by authority, and then attempted a containment charm that did absolutely nothing, at which point he announced cheerfully that catching them would be excellent hands-on experience and retreated to a safe distance while the class dissolved into chaos. Harry stunned 3 pixies with wandless effort that he kept deliberately small so it looked like it might be the wand. He handed them to Neville Longbottom, who was trying to peel one off his ear with a look of suffering patience, and then looked at Lockhart standing by the blackboard and confirmed data point 2. The man was not incompetent in the way that produced unfortunate mistakes. He was incompetent in the way that produced someone else deals with the results. Hermione caught 2 more. Ron dealt with the ones at the window. Between them, they had the room under control in 7 minutes, which left 23 minutes of class time in which Lockhart told a story about himself that began in the Sudan and contained 4 separate references to his own hair. After class, walking toward the Great Hall, Hermione said, "Memory charms." Harry nodded. He'd reached the same conclusion independently, but she'd clearly built the full architecture. "Walk me through it." The real heroes of every story he's written, the actual survivors, the actual experts, they all disappeared from public view around the same time Lockhart's books came out. Not dead, just quiet. No subsequent publications, no interviews, no corrections to the record. She had apparently spent part of the summer cross-referencing this. Memory charmed. He finds people who have actually done something impressive, gets the full account from them, then obliviates them and publishes their story as his own. Ron had stopped walking. "He can't, I mean, that's a serious crime. It's a Class 3 magical offense," Hermione said. "Unlawful memory modification, minimum 3 years in Azkaban." "How do we prove it?" Harry said. "We need someone he obliviated who retained partial memory. The charm doesn't always take completely if the subject has strong magical resistance, or we need him to attempt it in front of a witness." She paused. "Which he will, eventually. People like him always do because they've gotten away with it long enough to get sloppy." Harry thought about this. He thought about what Amelia had said once about distinguishing between this is a problem that needs solving right now and this is a problem that needs solving correctly. "We tell Amelia." "Already written to her," Hermione said. "She'll look into the disappeared sources. She has access to ministry records on memory modification reports, anything flagged unusual from the relevant years." "In the meantime," Harry said, "Lockhart is our defense professor." "Which means," Ron said, "we're teaching ourselves defense." "We were already doing that," Harry said. Ron thought about it. "Fair." The Chamber of Secrets opened in October, which Harry knew about before most of the school because he heard the voice. He was walking back from Quidditch practice. Wood had made him Seeker in first year. a record-setting appointment that had generated considerable administrative friction with McGonagall before she conceded, and he'd spent a year and a half proving it was correct when he heard it. Not a sound anyone else seemed to register. Something moving inside the walls, long and liquid and cold, and a voice that was speaking in a language that bypassed his ears entirely and arrived directly in some older part of his brain. He stopped walking. The voice faded. Kill, it had said, or something with that meaning, something hunting. He stood in the corridor for a moment in the October chill, processing the fact that he'd apparently understood it, and then he went to find Hermione. Parseltongue, she said before he'd finished the second sentence. I know what Parseltongue is, he said. You speak Parseltongue, which is different from knowing what it is. It's extraordinarily rare. It's associated historically with Salazar Slytherin, which means she stopped. He could see her building the architecture, Slytherin's monster, the Chamber of Secrets. There were rumors about it in Hogwarts, a history, but the account was incomplete. A monster that Slytherin supposedly sealed in the school. She looked at him. If you can speak Parseltongue, it's probably a snake, Harry said. A very large snake or a serpentine creature. She pulled her Ancient Runes textbook off the shelf. Give me an hour. An hour became 3, which became a week of research, which Hermione conducted with the focused urgency of someone who'd understood the stakes. Meanwhile, the attacks started. Mrs. Norris first, found petrified in a corridor with the chamber has been opened. Enemies of the air, beware, written in what turned out to be chicken blood on the wall above her. Then Colin Creevey, a first year with a camera who had been enthusiastically documenting Harry's existence since September. Then Justin Finch Fletchley and nearly headless Nick. The school was afraid. The school was also, in the way schools are, inclined toward rumor in the absence of information, and the rumor that found Harry was the one that had been floating since the night he'd spoken to a snake at the dueling club, Lockhart's dueling club, which had been both an administrative disaster and the most useful 40 minutes of entertainment Harry had had all year, and that rumor was that Harry Potter was the heir of Slytherin. Ron found this hilarious in a dark way. Hermione found it irrelevant. Harry found it mildly interesting as a study in how readily people abandoned evidence in favor of narrative. He wrote to Amelia about the attacks. She wrote back the next day, Basilisk. If the monster is serpentine ancient, housed in a medieval structure and is petrifying its victims, not killing them, then it's a basilisk. The petrification rather than death suggests the victims are seeing it indirectly. A reflection or through something. The eyes of a basilisk kill directly. Indirect sight petrifies. A pause, evidenced by the different pressure of the quill on the second line. Do not look for it. Do not let it find you. I am coming to Hogwarts this weekend to speak with Dumbledore. She came on Saturday. Harry knew she'd met with Dumbledore for 2 hours and then spent 30 minutes with McGonagall and then gone home, because she'd also spent 15 minutes with Harry in an empty classroom where she'd told him everything she'd told Dumbledore and not treated the information as something he needed to be protected from. The passage into the chamber is almost certainly in the girls' bathroom on the 2nd floor, she said. The ghost there, Moaning Myrtle, has been in that bathroom since 1943, which is when the last chamber opening occurred. Her death opened the chamber that time. She's connected to the entrance whether she knows it or not. How do we find the exact mechanism? Harry said. Talk to Myrtle, Amelia said simply. She's lonely and overlooked and people have been treating her as an inconvenience for 50 years. She'll talk to someone who listens. She looked at him. Hermione should go woman to woman, and Myrtle responds better to people who take her seriously. He relayed this to Hermione, who immediately went to Moaning Myrtle's bathroom and spent an hour listening to 50 years of grievances with the attentiveness of someone who had been taught that overlooked sources are often the best sources. She came back with a description of the sink with the snake engraving, the one that moved when you spoke to it, and she'd attempted a hissing sound herself and gotten nothing. I need you to open it, she told Harry. I know, he said. What's down there when I do? Basilisk, she said. 50-year-old, possibly larger, and whatever's been controlling it. She paused. The attacks aren't random. Something is directing it. The basilisk is a weapon, not an independent actor. Slytherin's heir, Harry said. Or something posing as one. She spread her research notes across the desk between them. Look at the sequence of victims. Muggle-borns, a Squib's cat, a blood traitor by association. It's ideological. Someone is making a statement, not just using a weapon. They looked at each other. We need to find the controller before we go into the chamber, Harry said. Agreed, and we need to tell Sirius and Remus. Already written, Harry said. Remus's reply arrived the next morning with a detailed account of basilisk physiology, weaknesses, and historical encounters, cross-referenced with relevant defensive magic, annotated in his precise hand. At the bottom, if you go in with a plan and with backup, not alone. Mirrors for the basilisks gaze multiple carried because they break. A rooster's crow will kill it if you can produce the sound magically. I'm working on a charm for that, don't go yet. Sirius's letter was shorter. Absolutely not without me, I mean it. Write me the minute you know anything new. The answer came in February and it came through Tom Riddle's diary. Ginny Weasley had been carrying it since September. Harry had noticed she was pale and distracted but had attributed it to first-year anxiety, which was a thing he now slightly regretted. When she collapsed and the diary was found empty of all its ink, the connection became clear. The diary had been writing back to her. Diary had something living in it. Someone had put it there. Harry and Hermione worked this out together in the library on a Sunday night, with Ron across from them eating his way through a plate of sandwiches and occasionally contributing lateral observations that turned out to be useful. Someone gave Ginny the diary, Harry said, at flourish and blots before school started. He looked at Ron, who was near her. Ron's jaw stopped moving. Malfoy, he said slowly. Draco Malfoy. Lucius Malfoy. He put down the sandwich. He grabbed her school things. He was handling them. He could have slipped it in. Lucius Malfoy, Death Eater, father, the kind of man who made political maneuvers look like accidents. He knew what was in it, Hermione said. He put it in deliberately, which means this entire year, the attacks, the petrifications, the fear in the school, he engineered it. Her voice was very controlled in the way it got when she was furious and managing it. He used an 11-year-old girl as a delivery mechanism. He used his own son's classmate, Harry said, knowing she'd be the first one it took. A long silence. Outside the library windows, February was doing something unpleasant to the sky. We stop the basilisk, Harry said. We recover Ginny. We get the evidence about Malfoy to Amelia. He looked at them both. In that order. The chamber first, Hermione said. Everything else after. I'm coming, Ron said in the tone that didn't leave room for argument. I know, Harry said. He wrote to Sirius and Remus that night, going in tomorrow. I know you want to come, but Hogwarts won't let you in without going through Dumbledore, and going through Dumbledore takes time, and Ginny Weasley is in the chamber. I have the plan. Remus, the Rooster Crow charm, can you send it tonight? I need it in the next 12 hours. Remus's reply arrived at 2 in the morning, which meant he'd been awake, probably had been awake since Harry's last letter, if Harry knew him, which he did. The charm was spelled out in full with 3 variations depending on the acoustic environment, and at the bottom, I trust your judgment. Come home. Sirius's letter was 4 words, you better come home. Harry tucked both letters away, performed the Rooster Crow charm 7 times until he could do it without thinking, and slept for 5 hours. The morning was grey and ordinary. They went to Moaning Myrtle's bathroom at 8 before anyone else was moving. Hermione brought her mirror compact, 3 extra mirrors folded into her robes, which Harry had not asked about and which suggested she'd been preparing for this specifically for weeks. Ron had his wand and the particular expression of someone who had committed to a course of action and wasn't going to think about it too hard. Harry opened the sink with a syllable of Parseltongue that felt entirely natural and entirely strange simultaneously, the way speaking a language you forgot you knew feels, and the entrance opened into dark. Down, Hermione said, already at the edge. Down, Harry agreed. They slid into dark and cold and the smell of ancient water and stone, and landed on a floor somewhere far below the school where the walls were carved with serpents, and the pipes overhead dripped, and the whole place had the quality of something sealed for decades and not entirely happy about being unsealed. Hermione lit her wand and said softly, mirrors out, don't look at anything directly until we know where it is. Ron had his mirror. Harry had his angled slightly down so he could watch the corridor behind them in reflection without looking back. The passage stretched ahead, long and carved and cold. They moved. The first obstacle was the wall of rock, the cave-in that separated the entrance shaft from the inner chamber, massive stones impassable to anyone without either extraordinary brute strength or the right application of force. Harry looked at it and thought about grape on a kitchen floor and directed intention and 8 years of practice, and he put both hands out and felt for the structural logic of the collapse and found the load-bearing point and shifted it precisely with enough concentrated force to clear a person-width passage without bringing the rest down. Ron looked at this for a moment. How long have you been able to do that? Few years, Harry said. Through here, watch your head. The inner chamber was vast and greenlit from some source Harry couldn't identify, and the statues of serpents on the walls were watching in the way that carvings sometimes watched in very old magical places. At the far end, at the base of an enormous stone face, Ginny Weasley was on the floor and a boy was standing over her, a boy Harry recognized after a moment as Tom Riddle, except clearer and more solid than a ghost, more present than a memory and carrying Harry's wand. Not Tom Riddle. What Tom Riddle had left in the diary fed on Ginny's life force grown strong enough to become almost real. Harry calculated this very quickly, the wand, the distance, the boy's confidence, the girl on the ground. That's my wand, he said. Riddle smiled. It is, I took it when I arrived, you won't be needing it. His voice was smooth and pleasant, and underneath it was something very old. Tom Marvolo Riddle, he said, with the particular pleasure of someone about to deliver information they consider poetic. Or rearranged, he drew in the air with the stolen wand. I am Lord Voldemort. That's an anagram, Hermione said from beside Harry. You changed your name to an anagram. Riddle blinked. Whatever response he'd anticipated, it hadn't been that. Tom Riddle is a Muggle name and you were ashamed of it, she continued with the tone of someone reading a case study. So you made a new name from its letters? That's, she paused, clearly choosing her word, very deliberate. It tells me a lot about you, actually. Hermione, Harry said mildly. What, it does? Riddle's composure had reassembled itself. The basilisk will come, he said to Harry specifically, and it will kill you. I will finish becoming real. And the mudblood girl, he glanced at Hermione with a flat contempt that made Harry's hands go very still, will have her place in the story too. Don't, Harry said, just the one word, very quiet. Don't what? Call her that. His voice hadn't changed temperature, ever to me or anyone else. Call her that again and we skip past the part where I try to do this cleanly. Riddle tilted his head with the curiosity of someone who found human attachment genuinely baffling. You'd risk yourself for her feelings. I'd risk a great deal more than that for considerably less reason, Harry said. But it's not about feelings, it's about accuracy. She's Hermione Granger and she's smarter than you and she's already identified 3 structural weaknesses in your plan. Riddle looked at Hermione. 4, she said, since you've been explaining the anagram. The basilisk came through the wall. Harry's eyes went to his mirror. In the small reflected oval he saw it, vast, scaled, green-black and ancient, moving with the liquid certainty of something that had never been threatened. Its eyes in reflection were still terrible, still the color of something that shouldn't exist, but reflection was survivable. He kept his eyes down and spoke. The rooster's crow that Remus had charm-worked into a vocal sequence came out of Harry's mouth, amplified and structured and perfectly targeted, and the basilisk recoiled with a sound like the whole chamber disagreeing with itself. It reared. Harry kept speaking, keeping the sound sustained, watching in the mirror as the creature's motion became confused, the magical frequency working on its nervous system the way Remus had described, not killing, not yet disrupting. Behind him he heard Ron say, "Ginny, Ginny, come on, wake up," and heard the stir of movement. Hermione was already moving on Riddle. She'd identified, apparently, that the diary construct was anchored to its physical source, the diary itself, which was somewhere on Riddle's person because the construct couldn't exist far from its origin. She went for it with the focused directness of someone who'd had this plan for longer than she'd admitted, and when Riddle pointed Harry's wand at her, she had a shield up that deflected the hex into the chamber wall and kept moving. Harry turned the rooster cry on the basilisk again, full force, and the creature shuddered, and in the mirror he watched it rear and then drop, the enormous weight of it hitting the chamber floor and sending vibration up through the stone and into his feet. Not dead. Stunned, the magical frequency having achieved what Remus had predicted it would achieve, a temporary disruption of the basilisk's sensory system, enough to incapacitate without needing to look at it directly. He wheeled on Riddle. Riddle had his wand raised, Harry's wand, pointed at Hermione, who'd closed the distance and had her hand on the diary, and the look on Riddle's face was the one Harry had seen in Quirrell's face the year before, the one that was very old and very cold and had never understood why other people's existence mattered. Harry took his wand back, not with a spell. He crossed the space between them in 3 steps and took it with his hand, wristlock first, the way Sirius had taught him for exactly this situation, close quarters, wand-to-wand incapacitation before the spell could fire, and Riddle was strong but he was a construct, not fully real, and Harry was 12 years old and had been doing physical combat training since he was 6 and the wand came free. He pointed it at the diary in Hermione's hand. "What destroys it?" he said. "Basilisk venom," Hermione said, "or the basilisk's fang, something with sufficient." "Got it." He looked at the stunned basilisk, he looked at the diary, he looked at Riddle, who was still standing, becoming less solid with every second the diary was away from him, the construct beginning to fail. "You can't," Riddle started. "Tom," Harry said, and his voice was almost gentle, "you lost this particular argument when you were a baby. I don't have the patience to lose it twice." He crossed to the basilisk, pulled one of the enormous fangs that had been damaged in the fall and drove it through the diary. Riddle screamed, the chamber screamed, and then there was only ink spreading across the stone floor in a wide black stain and a very old echo of something disappearing. Ginny Weasley was sitting up with Ron's hand supporting her back, and she was pale and crying and very much alive. They were back in Dumbledore's office within the hour. Fawkes had found them. The Phoenix had appeared in the chamber after Riddle dissolved, apparently as reliable a rescue mechanism as anything the school offered, and had carried them up through the pipe entrance. Ginny was in the hospital wing. Ron was with her. Harry and Hermione were in Dumbledore's office where a fire was burning, and the headmaster was looking at Harry with something that was layered in ways Harry had grown accustomed to trying to read. Lucius Malfoy was also there. He had arrived apparently because Dumbledore had been suspended from his position as headmaster by the Board of Governors in recent months, Malfoy's work, and had come to see the suspension's effects. He stood near the window in robes that cost more than most people's monthly wage and looked at Harry and Hermione with the smooth composure of someone who had never in his life been caught doing anything. Harry looked at him. "The diary," he said. "Tom Riddle's diary. You put it in Ginny Weasley's cauldron at Flourish and Blots." Not a question. He watched Malfoy's eyes for the flicker that confirmed it and found it briefly. "You knew what was in it. You used a 10-year-old girl to open the Chamber of Secrets, which has left multiple students petrified and one first-year nearly dead." Malfoy's expression was pleasant and entirely unmoved. "These are very serious accusations for a 12-year-old boy." "They are," Harry agreed. "Which is why I documented everything. The sequence of the attacks, the ideological pattern of target selection, the timeline matching to when you had access to Ginny's things. I've sent all of it to Amelia Bones at the Department of Magical Law Enforcement." He paused, watching Malfoy's composure do something very subtle at the edges. "She's good at finding things, I've noticed. She's been doing it my whole life." Dumbledore was watching this exchange with the quiet attention he brought to moments he found instructive. Malfoy looked at Harry for a long moment, then he smiled, something cold and precise. Your guardians have certainly trained you well. It was meant to diminish guardians, not family, the particular word choice of someone who wanted Harry to feel foundling. How very strategic of them. Thank you, Harry said. I'll tell them you said so. Malfoy left. Dumbledore looked at Harry after the door closed. You understood what was happening here considerably before most people would have. I had good information and time to work with it, Harry said. Yes, Dumbledore studied him. You also walked into that chamber with a plan. Hermione's plan mostly, Harry said. She built most of the architecture, I contributed the Parseltongue and the basilisk stun. He looked at Dumbledore directly. We work well together. Yes, Dumbledore said again in a different tone, one that Harry thought was making some kind of adjustment to whatever picture Dumbledore kept of him. I believe you do. Hermione, who had been standing slightly to the side with her arms folded and the expression of someone who had many more questions than she was currently asking, said, The basilisk is stunned in the chamber. It needs to be properly secured before it recovers. Dumbledore blinked. Quite right, Miss Granger. Also, she said, Ginny Weasley should not be blamed for this. She was a victim of magical coercion from October. Her actions during that time were not her own. I am entirely in agreement, Dumbledore said, and Lucius Malfoy should be prosecuted. That, Dumbledore said with a slight shift in his expression, may be more complicated. It's only complicated if people decide it is, Hermione said. The evidence is very clear. She looked at him with the particular Hermione gaze that did not contain the appropriate level of deference for a 12-year-old addressing a headmaster. Amelia Bones will make it uncomplicated. She was right, as it turned out. Amelia's investigation into Lucius Malfoy took 3 months, during which he hired 4 separate legal teams and attempted twice to have the evidence inadmissible on procedural grounds, and during which Amelia dismantled every procedural argument with the focused patience of someone who had been doing this since before Lucius Malfoy was politically relevant. He was not convicted, his lawyers were good and his connections were real, and the specific charge of knowingly placing a dark artifact on a minor's person was difficult to prove beyond the documentation Harry had assembled, but he was formally cautioned publicly, and the documentation went into his ministry file where it would live for the rest of his career. It was not justice entirely, but it was the beginning of a record, and Amelia had taught Harry that records were how you built cases, and cases were how you built accountability, and accountability was slow and it was frustrating, and it was the only thing that actually worked long-term. They came home for the summer and the house in Yorkshire had the quality it always had in July, warm and slightly chaotic and smelling of whatever Remus had been cooking since 3 in the afternoon. Sirius was in the garden when they arrived. He didn't say anything when Harry came through the gate, just pulled him into a hug that lasted long enough to say everything that needed saying, and Harry let it because sometimes you come home from something and you need a moment before you have to explain it. Right, Sirius said when he let go, keeping his hands on Harry's shoulders and looking at him with the direct assessment of someone checking for damage. You good? Yeah, Harry said. Hermione. Right here, Hermione said, coming through the gate behind him with her trunk. Also good. Sirius looked at her. She had ink on her hands and her hair was doing something particularly determined, and she was holding the strap of her bag with the grip of someone who'd been holding things tightly for several months. He pulled her in too. She went briefly rigid. She was always briefly rigid, had been since they'd known her, the particular hesitation of someone who'd had to relearn that physical comfort from people who loved you was safe, and then she didn't, and she held on for a moment. Chamber of Secrets, Sirius said over her head to Harry. You went into the actual Chamber of Secrets. We did, Harry said, with a plan. With a plan, Hermione confirmed into his shoulder. Sirius exhaled. Remus made soup, he said. Come inside and tell us everything in order and don't leave anything out because I will know. They went inside and the light was warm and Remus was in the kitchen with soup, and Amelia came in from her study with her reading glasses still on and her work face still mostly in place, except for the small specific thing that happened around her eyes when she saw them both. Harry put his bag down and sat at the kitchen table and felt the year settle off his shoulders the way things did when you were genuinely home, not just somewhere safe but somewhere that held you specifically. Start from the beginning, Remus said, setting the bowls down. So they did. Chapter 5, The Wolf and the Rat. The summer before 3rd year smelled like rain and baking bread, and occasionally the particular sharp edge of wolfsbane potion, which Remus had been brewing in the basement since June. He'd been brewing it himself for 2 years, since a potions contact in Edinburgh had worked out a reliable formula from the original Damocles Belby method. Amelia had arranged the supply chain for the ingredients. Some of them were restricted under the werewolf registry provisions and required ministry authorization, which she'd obtained through 3 layers of bureaucratic process that she described afterward as characteristically obstructive and which had taken 4 months, and Remus had been managing the monthly cycle more smoothly since then. The transformations were still difficult. They were always difficult. But he came back from them more himself than he used to, and the recovery period had shortened, and he slept in his own bed the morning after rather than on the kitchen floor. Harry had noticed all of this in the specific way he noticed things about people he cared about, not loudly, not with comment, just a steady ongoing awareness. He left the light on and the blanket on the chair and the thermos of tea, same as always. He'd also, without discussion, started keeping a second thermos in the kitchen cupboard specifically for the mornings after the moon, with a note tucked under it that said stronger than usual, because he'd observed that Remus preferred his tea stronger on those particular mornings and there was no reason not to accommodate that. Remus had found the note the first time and sat with it for a long moment before opening the thermos. He hadn't said anything, neither had Harry. That was its own kind of conversation. The summer was otherwise occupied with two things: Sirius's increasingly public legal status and the news that Hogwarts had hired a new defense against the dark arts professor. The legal status was complicated. He was officially not guilty. The Wisengamot record said so, and Amelia had the documentation sealed and cross-filed in 4 separate departments in case anyone tried to lose it. But not guilty in the legal sense and rehabilitated in the public consciousness were different projects, and the second one was slower and required a different set of tools. Some people still looked at him sideways in Diagon Alley. A Prophet columnist had written a piece in April that technically said nothing actionable but managed to imply, through careful word choice and strategic juxtaposition, that the Black family's history of dark allegiance was worth contextualizing when assessing Sirius's acquittal. Amelia had written a response. It was 3 paragraphs, and it was one of the most precise pieces of public dismantling Harry had ever read, and it ran in the Prophet's letters section because the paper was legally required to publish responses from ministry officials of her rank. The columnist did not write about Sirius again. "She's terrifying," Ron had said when Harry showed him the letter on the first day of summer. "That's the word people use, yes," Harry said. But the legal situation had a more immediate dimension too. Peter Pettigrew was still alive. Harry had known this for 2 years, had known it since he was 10, and Sirius, during one of the conversations that happened sometimes late at night when Sirius was in the mood to talk about the war, had explained exactly what had happened on that street in 1981 and why. A rat animagus, an unregistered one, living in the Weasley family as their pet since 1981. 12 years as Scabbers, quiet and overlooked and growing old in a way that no ordinary rat should, and nobody had connected it because nobody had known to look. Harry had sat on that information and thought about it carefully. He discussed it with Hermione, who had confirmed through independent research that the lifespan anomaly in the Weasley's pet was documented across 6 years of Ron's letters home to his parents, available in the Weasley family correspondence that Ron had mentioned, and that Hermione had with characteristic thoroughness cross-referenced against average rat lifespan data from a magical creature's reference. He told Amelia last Christmas. She'd gone very still in the way she went still when something confirmed a theory she'd been holding for a long time. "You're certain?" "Hermione's certain," Harry said, "which is better than me being certain. The rat is currently at Hogwarts. Ron brings him every year." "Yes." Amelia had looked at Sirius. Sirius had looked back at her with an expression that was controlled and careful, and had been controlled and careful for 2 years because that was what Amelia had asked of him, and because he'd promised and because he trusted her, but underneath the control was something that had been living in him since 1981, and that had a very specific name. "I need him alive," Amelia said. "For the trial, you understand me?" "I understand you," Sirius said. "Sirius." "I understand you, Amelia." His voice was flat and completely sincere. "I want him in front of the Wisengamot. I want him to say it. I want a record." A pause. "I've been wanting that longer than you've known about this." She'd nodded and started making plans. The new defense professor arrived at Hogwarts on September 1st, and Harry recognized him before the train had fully stopped, because Remus had sent him ahead with a letter in which he'd explained his appointment with the combination of genuine pleasure and careful understatement he brought to good news. "I've been asked to teach," he'd written. "I said yes. I trust this won't complicate things unduly." It would complicate things. It always complicated things, having Remus Lupin in a room, because he was the kind of teacher who made students think harder than they'd intended to, and that had consequences. But Harry had grinned at the letter and gone downstairs to tell Hermione, and she'd said, "Obviously he's the most qualified person for the job. This should have happened years ago." And Sirius had raised his mug in a toast and said to Moony, "Who is going to absolutely ruin everyone else's curve," and that had been that. Walking into defense on the first Thursday of term felt like coming home in a different building. Remus didn't treat them differently in class. This had been discussed, and Harry had told him directly that differential treatment would be worse, not better, and Remus had agreed with the slight smile that meant he'd already come to the same conclusion. But the quality of the teaching was different from anything Hogwarts had offered in the prior 2 years, in the same way that real rain is different from a description of rain. He taught the boggart lesson on the second week, wandered between students with the calm of someone entirely comfortable with uncertainty taking physical form, and Harry watched him from the side of the room and saw clearly what Remus had spent 13 years doing to himself, making himself small, making himself safe, and and saw equally clearly that in a classroom he didn't do it, that here he was simply himself, which was precise and warm and very, very good at this. Harry's boggart was Voldemort, not a body, not a face, a specific cold, the absence of warmth, the sensation he'd felt when Quirrell had collapsed in the mirror chamber and something had passed through him like weather. The class didn't know what they were seeing when it appeared. Harry stepped up and thought about what Remus had taught him about boggarts and transformed it, not into something funny exactly, but into something small, a diminishment, a cold thing in a box rattling around with no purchase on anything, and the class laughed a bit nervously and Harry stepped back and felt Remus's eyes on him for a moment. After class, Remus said, staying at the board while students filed out, "You're all right." "Yes," Harry said. "The boggart, I know what it was," Harry said. "I'm not afraid of it. That's different from pretending it doesn't exist." He paused. "You taught me that." Remus looked at him for a long moment. "I did," he said. "Yes." Hermione had 7 subjects and was attending all of them. This was logistically impossible, which was a fact that Ron noticed in the 3rd week when he saw her in arithmancy at the same time she'd apparently been in Muggle studies, and that Harry had known about since September because he was more observant than Ron about Hermione's movements, and also because she'd told him. He didn't raise it because she'd asked him not to, and because her reasons were her own, and he respected that. He did note privately that she was tired, and that the particular brightness in her eyes at the beginning of term had a strained quality behind it by October. He left it. She would tell him when she wanted to tell him, and before that she'd solve whatever she was trying to solve because that was how Hermione worked. He had his own preoccupation, the Dementors. They'd been stationed at the school's entrances since September as security against, officially, the escaped prisoner Sirius Black, which was an irony so complete Harry had to admire its architecture even as it made him angry. He'd heard the reasoning. Sirius had escaped from Azkaban, the first person ever to do so, and the Ministry wanted him recaptured, and Dementors were the tool the Ministry had. The reasoning was logical. The Dementors were still wrong, and not just because they were protecting against someone who didn't need to be protected against. They affected Harry badly. He'd known they would. Remus had warned him, had explained that Dementors forced you to relive your worst memories, and that Harry's worst memories had particular weight, but knowing it and experiencing it were different. The first time one came too close on the train, he heard his mother's voice and then his father's and then a sound that was cold and final, and he came back to himself on the compartment floor with Hermione's hand on his arm and Remus handing him chocolate. He ate the chocolate and said nothing for a moment and then said, "I want to learn the Patronus charm." Remus had said, "I know, I'll teach you." They did it on Tuesday evenings after dinner in an empty classroom on the 3rd floor. Remus had a boggart in a box, a different one, not the floating cold but a silver-white embodiment of the Dementor effect, close enough to train against without the actual danger, and Harry worked at the charm with the focused stubbornness he brought to things that mattered. The theory was straightforward, the practice was not. The charm required holding a specific memory, not just a happy one, Remus explained, but a real one, something with substance and heat, not just pleasant but true, and using it as a vehicle for a specific magical configuration that forced warmth outward in a way that disrupted the Dementor's sensory mechanism. Harry tried his parents. He tried his first day of flying. He tried the Yorkshire garden at dusk when Sirius had talked about his father. Nothing solidified. Wisps light, a shimmer that collapsed under pressure. "What are you using?" Remus asked on the 4th Tuesday. Harry told him. Remus was quiet for a moment. "These are all true memories," he said. "They're real," but he paused, choosing carefully. "The memories connected to your parents carry grief, not just joy. The joy is real, but the grief sits beside it and weighs the memory down when you're under pressure." He looked at Harry with the directness he used when something was important. "Think about something that has no loss attached to it, something that is only itself," Harry thought. He thought about Hermione at 9 years old sitting on his kitchen floor explaining burst pipes and garden hoses and grey-pass telekinesis. He thought about Sirius laughing at something in the garden, the real laugh, the one that was only ever fully real when he thought nobody was watching. He thought about Remus reading to him when he was small, both of them on the kitchen floor with a book between them, and the particular quality of that stillness. He raised his wand and cast. The Patronus exploded out of the tip of his wand as a stag, enormous, silver-antlered, so real it moved, and it crossed the room and the boggart Dementor flinched backward and the classroom was full of light. Remus made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Harry lowered his wand and looked at the stag as it faded. He knew what it was. He'd seen pictures of his father's animagus form. He looked at Remus and saw Remus looking at the fading light with an expression so complex it moved through several things before settling on something that was quiet and grateful and full of a history Harry was only partially part of. "Dad," Harry said softly. "Yes," Remus said. "Your father and you." He cleared his throat. "Your form reflects your own magical nature, not just the memory. The stag chose you." He paused. "James would have." He stopped, tried again. "He'd have been very pleased." "I know," Harry said. They packed up the boggart box in comfortable quiet and walked back down the corridor to the warmth of the castle and didn't need to say anything else about it. Peter Pettigrew came into the open on a Wednesday in November. It happened because Sirius came to Hogwarts. He'd written to Amelia in October, "I can't wait until summer. Pettigrew's been at the school for 3 months. Every day is a day he could run. I need to move." Amelia had written back, "I know, I'm ready. Come to the school, I'll arrange the access. Bring Remus." The plan was specific. Sirius and Amelia would come to Hogwarts under official ministry auspices. Amelia had the authority to conduct an on-site investigation into any matter of magical law, and she'd been building the documentation on Pettigrew for 2 years. Remus would be present as a material witness. They would confront Pettigrew in a controlled environment, restrain him, and take him into ministry custody before the night was out. Harry and Hermione were told in advance, which was the household's way: information, not protection. "You're not coming," Amelia said. It wasn't harsh, it was specific. "This is a ministry operation and you are students. You'll know what happens when it happens." "Understood," Hermione said immediately. Harry said, "What's the contingency if he transforms and runs?" Amelia looked at him for a beat that acknowledged it was a good question. "Sirius can follow him in animagus form. A large black dog is faster than a rat in open ground, and I'll have 2 auras at the perimeter who know what to look for." "Okay," Harry said. He and Hermione waited in the common room that night, not talking much, doing their work with the focused distraction of people who were thinking about something else. Ron was with them because Ron's rat was involved, and Ron deserved to know, though telling him had been one of the more difficult conversations Harry had managed. Watching Ron's face move through disbelief and horror and a grief that was specific and real. 12 years, Scabbers had been in the family, on his brother Percy's desk, in Ron's pocket, sleeping on his pillow. "He wasn't your pet," Harry had said as gently as he could. "He was someone hiding." "I know," Ron said. He'd looked at his hands. "He slept on my pillow, mate." Harry hadn't been able to make that better. He just sat with Ron in the particular silence that means "I'm not going anywhere." The events of the Wednesday unfolded over 3 hours. What Harry and Hermione knew from the combined account given by Sirius, Remus, and Amelia over the following 2 days, assembled from 3 perspectives with the occasional contradiction ironed out through careful cross-referencing. Pettigrew had been in the Gryffindor common room in rat form when Sirius and Amelia arrived at the castle. Remus had located him with the detection charm, the same one he'd been refining for 2 years for this exact purpose, and Sirius had gone into the common room as a dog. The specific tactical choice had been Amelia's. The dog was less threatening to the rat's instincts than 2 people with wands. Scabbers had bolted in the direction of a second-floor corridor and been cut off at the exit by the 2 auras, and then Sirius had stood between the rat and the window, and Amelia had been at the door, and Pettigrew had transformed. He was small and pale and had gone to fat in 12 years as a kept animal, and he'd cried immediately, which was apparently as consistent with his character as Harry had always expected. He'd cried, and he'd tried to bargain, and he'd tried to appeal to Sirius directly, which Sirius had received with a stillness that Remus described as the most controlled thing he'd ever seen Sirius manage. He said, "I did it for him, Sirius. I had no choice. He would have killed me," Remus said, sitting at the kitchen table 3 days later. And Sirius said very quietly, "You had the same choice Lily and James had. You just made the other one." He stopped. That was all. Then he stepped back and let Amelia take him. Amelia had him in ministry custody by midnight. The trial was in February. It was, Amelia said afterward, the clearest case she'd ever presented, which was a significant statement from someone who'd presented hundreds. Pettigrew had Veritaserum, administered under the strict protocols that made it admissible, and under it he confirmed every element of the relevant facts. His voluntary approach to Voldemort in the year before Godric's Hollow, his passing of the Potter's location, his deliberate framing of Sirius Black, his 12 years of hiding. He cried through most of it, which the Wisengamot found, depending on individual member, either pitiable or aggravating. Harry and Hermione were in the gallery. Amelia had arranged it through official channels. They were named parties in the matter of Sirius Black's original wrongful conviction, their testimony being part of the evidentiary basis for Sirius's acquittal, which meant they had standing to observe proceedings. The gallery was small and cold, and they sat side by side, while Amelia laid out 14 years of wrongdoing with the methodical precision of someone who had been waiting for this exact moment and was not going to rush it. Sirius was in the gallery too, 1 row back. Harry didn't look at him during the proceedings. He didn't need to. He could feel from the quality of the silence beside him that Sirius was entirely present and entirely still, the way he went still when something needed to be witnessed rather than acted on. Verdict was not guilty on all counts against Sirius Black, formalized and entered into permanent record, and guilty on the relevant counts against Pettigrew, betrayal of persons under Fidelius charm, 12 counts of manslaughter for the Muggles killed in his deliberate explosion, conspiracy to obstruct justice. The sentence was 20 years in Azkaban. When the chief warlock read the verdict, Harry heard Sirius exhale behind him. It was a small sound. It contained 12 years. Afterward, outside the ministry building in the cold February afternoon, Sirius stood on the steps and looked at the sky for a long moment. Harry stood next to him. Hermione was on his other side, her breath making small clouds in the air. Then Sirius said, "He's really gone. The record says he's really gone." "Yes," Harry said. "James and Lily's record says—" "Yes," Harry said again. Sirius was quiet for a moment more. Then he put his arm around Harry's shoulders and Harry leaned into it slightly, the way he'd learned to, and it was the same and different from all the times before because something had just closed that had been open since before Harry could remember. Amelia came out of the ministry doors behind them, pulling her coat straight. "We're going to be late for dinner," she said, which was not the most poetically appropriate thing to say and was exactly the right thing to say because it was forward-facing, because it pointed toward the house in Yorkshire and the kitchen table and the life that was continuing. "You're always late," Sirius said. "I'm reliably delayed, there's a distinction." She started down the steps. "Come on, Remus is cooking." March brought Remus's secret. It came out the way most things that have been held for too long eventually come out, not all at once, not by choice, but through the accumulation of small things that were each individually manageable and collectively not. The month had been hard. The wolfsbane supply had been interrupted by a ministry review of restricted ingredients, the result of a complaint filed by a potions board member who had opinions about werewolf access to certain compounds. Remus had missed 1 month's supply. The transformation had been bad. He came back from it with his arm bandaged where he'd caught it on the stone steps of the basement, and Harry had been the one to find him in the kitchen that morning and had sat with him while he drank his tea and hadn't asked questions. Hermione had come down an hour later and had seen the bandage and had said very quietly and with enormous precision, "That's not from the usual strain. What happened with the wolfsbane?" He'd told them. He told them about the complaint and the review and the ministry official who had cited the werewolf registry provision and suggested that providing restricted ingredients to unregistered lycanthropes. Remus had never registered on Amelia's specific legal advice, on the grounds that the registry was an instrument of discrimination and that its provisions were being contested in a case she was building, was a potential violation of Section 14. Hermione had gone from concerned to furious in the time it took to pour a second cup of tea. Section 14 was written in 1947 by a committee that included 3 known greyback sympathizers, she said. It has never been successfully applied in a case involving a werewolf with no criminal history and documented professional standing. That ministry official is either ignorant of the case history or is deliberately misapplying the statute. "Probably the second one," Remus said mildly. "I'm writing to Amelia today." "I'd appreciate that," he said, and then because Hermione's focused fury had opened something in the conversation, "It's been a long year. This is not the first time something like this has happened." Harry had been listening. "What do you mean?" Remus looked at his tea. "Some of the students know," he said, "or suspect. One parent wrote to the school in October with what they called concerns. Dumbledore handled it." But he paused. "I've been here before. I lasted 2 years at my last position. The year before that, 8 months. Before that," he stopped. "It always comes out sooner or later. Something like this happens or a student sees something or someone talks." He said it without self-pity, just the level statement of a fact he'd had a long time to make peace with. "You're not losing this job," Harry said. Remus looked at him. "Amelia will handle the Section 14 thing, you know she will. She's been building the registry challenge for 2 years. He looked at Remus steadily. "And when it comes out at school, which it will, I know it will, we handle it the same way we handle everything else, with information and without apology." Remus was quiet for a long moment. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," Harry said. "I want to, there's a difference." He paused. "You told me that actually," a slight smile. "Did I, year before last, about something else? And you just stored it away." "I store everything away," Harry said. "You know this about me." Hermione had already taken out parchment and was writing in her fast, particular script, and the scratch of her quill against the parchment was the sound of a problem being addressed. Remus watched her for a moment and then looked at Harry, and the thing between them was old and warm and had been built from thousands of small moments, thermos of tea and blankets and second thermos and stronger than usual notes and light left on in the dark. "Thank you," Remus said, simply. "Always," Harry said. It came out in April. Not because of anything dramatic, not a transformation in front of students, not a newspaper headline, but because Draco Malfoy, who had spent 2 years carefully despising everyone in Harry's circle and who had the particular gift of knowing where pressure points were, had put together the pieces, the monthly absences, the pallor, the wolfsbane smell that no amount of masking could fully disguise, and had chosen to announce his conclusion loudly in the corridor outside the Great Hall on a Thursday afternoon. "Lupin's a werewolf," Malfoy said clearly to the group of fourth years around him. "Our defense professor is a werewolf, thought everyone should know." The corridor went quiet in the way corridors go quiet when something is said that everybody needs to process. Harry was there. He'd been walking from Charms. He stopped. "Yes," he said. Malfoy looked at him. "Remus Lupin is a werewolf," Harry said into the silence conversationally. "He's also the best defense professor this school has had in living memory. He fought in the Order of the Phoenix during the war. He's a published magical creatures scholar and he's been teaching here since September without a single incident because he manages his condition with wolfsbane potion and a degree of professionalism that makes most people in this building look casual by comparison." Looked at Malfoy with the particular calm that Amelia had taught him, the one that doesn't need to perform anything. Your point. Malfoy's composure did something at the edges. His point, he said, recovering, is that a werewolf shouldn't be teaching children. Your father shouldn't be in public with children either, Harry said, given his record, but the ministry hasn't gotten around to that yet. He said it without heat, without drama, just information. Thank you for the announcement, Draco. Very helpful, gave me a chance to say all that. He kept walking. Behind him he heard Hermione, who had apparently been in the corridor too. Just so everyone's clear, werewolves are only dangerous during transformation. Professor Lupin has not transformed near students. The magical creature that is actually most likely to harm students is a Null, and we keep those in the herbology greenhouse. That's not the point, Malfoy said. What is the point? She asked with the tone of someone genuinely requesting clarity. Because if the point is that Professor Lupin's medical condition makes him less qualified to teach, then that's a factual claim I can address. And if the point is that he's less worthy because of something he didn't choose, then that's a moral claim, and I'd like to hear you defend it. Nobody defended it. Remus heard about this the same day, through Neville Longbottom, who had been in the corridor and told him, because Neville was the kind of person who thought people deserved to know when someone had gone to bat for them. He came to find Harry after dinner. They walked in the grounds for a bit in the April evening while the sky turned colours and the castle lights came on behind them. You didn't have to do that, Remus said. You keep saying that, Harry said. I keep telling you I know. The Malfoy comment was a bit much. Probably, Harry admitted, but it was accurate. A silence. They walked. Somewhere in the grounds an owl was testing its voice against the evening. The students are fine, Remus said eventually. A few of them are uncomfortable, most aren't. He paused. I've never in any school had a year where the students went to bat, not once. Then they were at worse schools, Harry said. Remus made a sound that might have been a laugh. Yes, perhaps they were. The summer came bright and warm, and the Wolfsbane case moved forward, and Amelia argued the Section 14 challenge before the Magical Creatures Regulatory Board in July, and won the right to a formal statutory review, which was not a complete victory but was the first meaningful crack in the provision in 40 years. Sirius was in the garden every evening when the weather was good. He'd started to look like himself, not completely. There were still the shadows, there were still the nights when Harry heard him walking the house, but more himself. He'd taken to flying again properly, not just around the house but out in the hills when the Muggle air traffic made it feasible, and he came back from those flights with the particular looseness in his shoulders that meant he'd been somewhere that was fully his. Remus was reading in the garden on the Thursday Amelia came home from the regulatory board hearing and told them about the crack in the provision. Sirius opened a bottle of something that had been in Amelia's cabinet since a Christmas 4 years ago and poured 4 glasses and handed them around and said, "To cracks, Remus said with a quiet smile. And to Hermione Granger, Sirius added, looking at her across the table, who terrorized a corridor of 4th years into silence with a point about Gnarls. That's accurate, Hermione said, accepting this without false modesty. The Gnarl comparison was statistically sound. Of course it was, Sirius said. Harry looked around the table, the garden in the evening light, the 4 of them and Amelia with her glass raised, the house behind them warm and lit, and thought about what he'd told the boggart in November, the memory of no loss attached to it, only itself. He'd thought at the time of specific moments. Now he thought the whole thing assembled, the whole long accumulation of thermos and blanket and biscuit debates and garden wall conversations, and 4 people who had found each other through grief and law and stubborn love was the memory. All of it together, the weight of something that was entirely only what it was. He raised his glass. To cracks, he said. Chapter 6, The Fire and the Name. The Triwizard Tournament was announced at the start of term feast in September, and Harry listened to Dumbledore explain the rules with the particular attention he gave to things that felt like they had more architecture than they were showing. An impartial magical judge, the Goblet of Fire, would select 1 champion from each of 3 schools. The age restriction was 17 and older. The prize was 1,000 galleons and eternal glory, which Harry found slightly overwrought but which appeared to be producing genuine enthusiasm in approximately 70% of the student body. He leaned to Ron. What do you think about the tournament? Ron had been watching the goblet with visible longing. It sounds brilliant. Shame about the age line. Yes, Harry was watching Dumbledore. Shame. Hermione, on his other side, had been writing in her notebook since the announcement began. She had a system for new information, write everything down immediately, organize later, let nothing that might be relevant slip by. 3 tasks, she said, not looking up. Designed to test magical skill, daring, and powers of deduction unknown in advance. The champion is chosen by an impartial judge. She paused. An impartial judge can be manipulated. That's assuming someone wants to, Ron said. Someone always wants to, Harry said. At minimum, the schools will each try to put in their strongest possible candidate. Beauxbatons and Durmstrang are both competitive institutions, Durmstrang especially. Karkaroff's school, Hermione said. He's a former Death Eater turned informant in exchange for his freedom. She closed her notebook. He'll be at this school for the duration of the tournament. They looked at each other over Ron's head. We watch, Harry said, same as always. he wrote to Amelia that night. She replied within 48 hours, I know about Karkaroff. He's been on a watch list since his release. His attendance at Hogwarts is being monitored. Be aware that the tournament creates an environment where unusual magical events can be explained away. Keep your observations specific and documented. And then at the bottom, in slightly different ink, as though she'd added it after the letter was finished, Sirius wanted me to tell you he'd bet the Yorkshire house that someone tries to put your name in. His instincts on this kind of thing are generally sound. Be ready. Someone put Harry's name in the goblet of fire on the Thursday of the second week. The flame turned blue-white and spat out 4 pieces of parchment instead of 3, and the last one said Harry Potter in his own school's colours, and the Great Hall went through approximately 15 distinct emotional registers in the span of 10 seconds. Harry sat very still. He heard his name read. He heard the response, the murmur, the confusion, the scattered applause from people who decided this was exciting, the stony silence from the Durmstrang and Beauxbaton students who had 1 champion each and were now looking at a school with 2. He heard Dumbledore ask him to step forward with the other champions. He stood up. He was 14 years old and someone had entered his name in a magically binding contract without his knowledge or consent, which was 2 separate crimes and also a trap, and he walked up to the front of the Great Hall with the calm that Amelia had been building into him since he was old enough to understand that calm was a tool and panic was a liability. Dumbledore looked at him as he passed. The blue eyes were doing their layered thing. I didn't enter my name, Harry said quietly before Dumbledore could say anything. I want that on record. It will be, Dumbledore said. In the anteroom with Cedric Diggory and Fleur Delacour and Victor Crumb, Harry stood against the wall and assessed the situation while the adults argued. The 3 champions from the other schools were watching him with varying degrees of suspicion and interest. He didn't blame them, he'd be suspicious too. Cedric, who was 17 and had the look of someone who'd prepared carefully for this and was now recalibrating, said to Harry, Do you know how it happened? Not yet, Harry said, but I'm going to find out. He said nothing else. He waited while Dumbledore and Karkaroff and Madame Maxime argued about the rules and the binding magic and what could or couldn't be done, and he listened and filed everything he heard, and when it was over and he walked back into the castle, he was already building the architecture of it. He wrote to Sirius and Hermione simultaneously. Hermione was standing 10 feet away when he got back to the common room, but writing felt more complete than talking, more organized, so he wrote to her too, and she read the note with her arms folded and said, Yes, someone wanted you in the tournament. The question is why? To kill me, Harry said, or to get me somewhere specific. Tournament provides both access and plausible deniability. A champion dying in a task is a tragedy, not an assassination. Ron, sitting nearby with a look on his face that had moved past shock into the focused attention he brought to things that mattered, said, So someone's working a long game. Yes, Harry said. Voldemort, Hermione said. Or someone working for him, or someone who wants what Voldemort wants without the inconvenience of his actual presence. Harry looked at them, but assume it's Voldemort and we work backward from there. What does he need? Hermione sat down. She pulled her notebook out. He needs a body, she said. We established after first year that he can persist in some form without a physical body, but that it's limited if he wants to return fully. She was writing while she talked, the pen moving fast. There are rituals, dark ones, old ones, the kind that require specific ingredients. She paused, including an enemy's blood. The 3 of them sat with that. Mine, Harry said. Yours, Hermione confirmed. You're the most famous enemy Voldemort has. Your blood would be the most symbolically and magically potent. It might also be practically necessary. The connection between your wands, the shared core, the fact that whatever your mother's protection did left a specific magical signature in your blood. She closed her notebook. This tournament ends with someone trying to get your blood. Then we need to know how they're planning to do it, Harry said, which means we need to know who entered my name. Sirius arrived at Hogwarts the following Saturday under a ministry visitor's pass that Amelia had arranged with a speed that suggested she'd anticipated needing it. He came to the castle looking like he'd slept approximately 4 hours and hadn't cared about that, and he sat with Harry and Hermione in an empty classroom while Remus stood at the door keeping watch, which was a household configuration they'd all been in before and which had a familiar quality that helped. Moody, Sirius said 20 minutes into Harry's account. The new Dada teacher, Mad-Eye Moody. Harry stopped. You know him. I know of him. The real Alastair Moody is one of the most paranoid, experienced auras alive. He retired from active service 18 months ago and has barely been seen since. Sirius's eyes were very direct. Amelia had his return to public life flagged in our correspondence. He's been behaving differently from his pre-retirement self in ways that his colleagues have noted but attributed to age and the effects of his injuries. A pause. If I wanted to place a spy in Hogwarts for a year, someone with authority and access and a reason to monitor Harry specifically, an impersonation of a respected ex-Auror would be a very clean approach. Polyjuice, Hermione said immediately. Monthly supply needed, Harry said. A month at a time, which means someone planning very far ahead. He thought about the corridor in second year. Hermione's Polyjuice researched the specific logistics of maintaining a sustained impersonation. If it's Polyjuice, then the real Moody is being kept somewhere, alive as a source. Amelia's going to want to move on this quickly, Sirius said. How quickly can she? Harry asked. She'll need cause to enter Moody's quarters, probable cause documented because she does things correctly. Sirius looked at Harry, which means we need something observable and documentable that creates that cause. I'll watch him, Harry said. I've been watching him. I just didn't have the right frame for what I was seeing. He went back to watching with the frame Sirius had given him, and the difference was immediate. Pseudo-Moody's patterns made a different kind of sense now, the way he tracked Harry specifically, across corridors, across meals, the particular interest he'd taken in Harry's preparation for the first task. He was managing Harry towards something. Not against him, not yet, but positioning him, keeping him alive and prepared and in the tournament while steering his approach in ways that would put him in the right place at the right time. He documented all of it. He gave the documentation to Hermione, who organized it, and gave it to Sirius, who gave it to Amelia. The first task was dragons. Harry knew this in advance, not through cheating, but because Hermione had identified that Hagrid was doing something in the Forbidden Forest on the Tuesday before the task, and Harry had gone to find out. And what he'd found was 4 dragons in large enclosures with very tired handlers, and he'd come back and told Cedric Diggory because he thought Cedric deserved the information, and Cedric seemed like the kind of person who wouldn't take the edge it gave him and behave badly with it. Cedric had looked at him for a moment and then said, "Why are you telling me?" "Because I didn't earn knowing, and I'd rather level the field than win with an advantage I didn't deserve," Harry said. Cedric had nodded slowly, like someone revising an assessment. "You're not what I expected." "Most people say that," Harry said. He prepared for the dragon Hungarian horntail, the one he'd drawn, which was either coincidence or Pseudo-Moody's management, and he suspected the latter, with a specificity that came from having grown up with people who planned. Not just the summoning charm for his firebolt, which was the obvious approach in which he used, but everything around it, where the dragon's blind spots were anatomically, what its fire range looked like in the enclosed space of the arena, what distraction techniques would work on a creature of that size and intelligence, where the egg was positioned relative to the dragon's defensive stance. He got the egg in 2 minutes and 40 seconds. The crowd's reaction was something he didn't think about until later. What he thought about in the moment was the mechanics of the problem, and the problem was solved, and he landed with the egg under his arm and his heart still steady. Sirius watched from the stands under disillusionment charm that Amelia had applied herself, which was technically a breach of the spectator protocols and which she had decided to be comfortable with. He appeared in the corridor afterward, visible again, and said, 2:40. His voice was perfectly even. Your father's record for Seeker was 2 minutes even, but he had a clear field. Next time tell him to send a harder dragon, Harry said. Sirius made a sound that was mostly exhale and put his hand on Harry's shoulder and kept it there for a moment. That was all. The golden egg screamed. Every champion's did. That was the puzzle, to work out what it meant, what the underwater sound encoded. Harry opened his in the common room, and the sound was so awful that people covered their ears, and Neville knocked over his charm's homework, and Ron said something extremely impolite. Harry closed the egg and thought. He thought about what Hermione had said about the task's skill, daring, powers of deduction, and about what kind of puzzle required an underwater approach, and he went to the library and found the relevant section in Fantastic Beasts on merpeople and their vocal range, and came back to the common room and told Hermione, "Open it underwater." She looked at him. "Obviously," she said. "The question is where and how." The prefect's bathroom, as it turned out. Cedric Diggory had figured the same thing out and gave Harry the password because Harry had told him about the dragons, which Harry appreciated as a clean exchange. The egg opened in the bath gave him a 60-second clue about hostages at the bottom of the lake. He told Hermione the next morning. She went white. "They're going to take someone we care about," she said. "That's what it means, to make us want to go in." "Yes," Harry said. "Which means whoever is managing this has already decided who that someone is." She was very still. "Harry, I know," he said. "Don't panic, we plan." She didn't panic. She was afraid. He could see it, knew her well enough to read the specific texture of Hermione Granger, afraid, which looked like control maintained under significant pressure, but she didn't panic. "If they take me," she said, you complete the task, Harry. The hostage is safe regardless of whether the champion rescues them. That's the rules. You don't need to." "I know the rules," he said. "I also know that if they take you, I'm going to the bottom of that lake." He said it without drama, just accuracy. "So let's make sure I can do it in under an hour." The gillyweed approach had been Neville Longbottom's contribution, which surprised some people and not Harry, who had noticed a long time ago that Neville knew more about magical plants than anyone at Hogwarts, including Sprout, and who had asked him directly and gotten a very detailed answer about gillyweed's effects and duration, and the specific conditions of the Black Lake that made it feasible. He practiced the underwater navigation approach in the lake twice before February, once in December when the water was brutal and he'd used a warming charm that Remus had taught him, and once in January when he had a better sense of what he was navigating toward. The second task was cold and dark and straightforward. He went in at the cannon shot with gillyweed already activating, felt his body change in the way it always felt wrong and then felt right, and navigated by the specific logic of where the merpeople would have put the hostages relative to their settlement and the task structure. He found the bottom in 37 minutes. Hermione was there. She was bound to a stone pillar with 4 others, Ron, Fleur's sister and Cedric's girlfriend, all magically asleep and perfectly safe and arranged in a row with merpeople guards watching at a distance. He took Hermione free first. She was unconscious and cold and completely fine. Fleur wasn't coming. He could tell from the angles of approach from which paths had been disturbed in the silt that she'd been forced back, and her sister was still bound at the pillar with nobody coming. Took her free too. He had the time. He surfaced with both of them and got them to the platform and woke Hermione up with a spell while the crowd made a noise above him, and she came awake fast and oriented immediately in the way she always did, and the first thing she said was, "Fleur's sister." "Here," Harry said, nodding to the small girl wrapped in a blanket beside him. Hermione looked at her, then back at Harry, and her expression did the thing it sometimes did when something was confirmed. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me," Harry said. "You'd have done it." "Obviously," she said, "but you did it." He came second in the task, behind Crumb on time, ahead of Cedric. Fleur thanked him for her sister with a warmth that surprised people who'd categorized her as cold. He accepted it without ceremony. The documentation on Pseudo-Moody reached Amelia in March. She acted in April, quietly and without announcement, entered Moody's quarters under properly documented probable cause warrant that she'd had airtight for 6 weeks and had been waiting to use until the timing was correct. The real Alastair Moody was in a magical trunk, alive, maintained in a condition adequate for polyjuice harvesting, which had been sustaining Bartemius Crouch Jr.'s impersonation since September. Crouch Jr. was a Death Eater, had been since he was 17. Had been sent to Azkaban by his own father, and had apparently escaped through means that Amelia described in her letter to Harry as a significant ministry security failure that I am addressing, which was as close to furious as her written correspondence got. He was in ministry custody by the end of April. Harry read the letter in the Gryffindor common room and then put it down and sat with the information. It confirmed what they'd been building toward for 9 months. It confirmed that Voldemort had a loyal follower in the school, managing the tournament toward a specific outcome, which meant the third task, the maze, had a trap in it, something at the end that would get Harry somewhere specific. He wrote back to Amelia, "The portieres in the maze has to be. Crouch was managing my performance through the first 2 tasks, keeping me competitive, keeping me in position. The Triwizard Cup is probably a portkey. Where would it go?" Her reply was 24 hours, working on it. "Don't touch the cup, I'm putting auras in the maze." He wrote back, "I know, but if Voldemort is waiting at the other end and I don't come through, he'll try another way. He's been trying to get to me since I was 13 months old. Eventually we do this, better when we're ready." A longer pause this time. "Then we are going to have a significant conversation about this when you come home. In the meantime, I have 3 auras in position. If you touch that cup and something happens, they will follow in 60 seconds. Do not be heroic." "I know the difference between heroic and strategic," he wrote back. "You learned it from Sirius. That's not entirely reassuring." He almost smiled at that. The night before the third task, Sirius came to the castle again. They sat in an empty classroom, the same one they always used, which had become over 4 years a sort of household annex in a school that wasn't home but had its own weight, and Sirius told Harry everything he knew about Voldemort's possible resurrection rituals, not to frighten him, because Harry had asked and Sirius had decided a long time ago that the only protection Harry actually needed from information was the right framing for it. "Bone, flesh, blood," Sirius said, "the old ritual. Bone from the father, flesh from a servant, blood from an enemy. If he's going to resurrect properly in a body that lasts, it's that one." He paused. "You're the enemy." "I know," Harry said. "Your blood doesn't kill you to take, he needs you alive for it. Which means if I'm taken to him I have a window." Harry looked at the floor, then up. "He'll want to fight, that's who he is, he'll want to prove something." "Yes," Sirius said. "He's going to want to duel you. He'll want to demonstrate to his followers that he's back, that he's powerful, that you're—" He stopped. "He doesn't understand you, he never has. He understands power in a specific way and you're something he doesn't have a category for." Harry thought about this. "He doesn't understand why people fight for each other rather than for themselves." "No," Sirius said. "He genuinely doesn't. He's always thought that was weakness. Your mother," he paused. "Your mother died for love." He considered that the most irrational possible choice. What he didn't understand was that the love was the power. It's not a metaphor, it's a mechanism. "Remus explained it to me last year," Harry said. "Theoretically, the magical chemistry of sacrifice-based protection, the specific configuration that Lily's death created in my blood." He paused. "I've been thinking about it. And if my blood is the mechanism of the protection, then my blood in his resurrection ritual carries the protection with it." He looked at Sirius steadily. "Which means if he uses my blood to come back, the protection she gave me becomes part of his resurrection. He'll be able to touch me, but I'll have a tether." Sirius stared at him. "A tether," he said carefully. "To life," Harry said. "As long as he's alive, the thing she put in my blood is part of his construction. I don't die easily while he's walking around with that in him." He paused. "I'm not certain, it's theoretical, but Hermione and I worked through the logic twice and we can't find the gap." Sirius was very still for a long moment, then he said, "You've been sitting on this theory for how long? Since January. And you're telling me now because I need you to understand that going through that cup is not me being reckless," Harry said. "It's me following the logic. Voldemort is coming back. He's been working toward it for 4 years. If not the tournament, something else next year or the year after. I'd rather it happen here now when Amelia has auras in position and we've had 9 months to prepare than somewhere I haven't seen coming." He paused. "It's what Amelia would do, control the variables you can control." Sirius looked at him for a long time, then he said, "You are terrifyingly good at sounding reasonable when you're doing something insane." "I learned it from Amelia," Harry said. "She's going to be furious. She's going to be furious regardless. At least this way she'll also be correct." The maze opened at dusk. Harry walked in with his wand in hand and the calm of someone who had done the preparation and was ready to meet the work. The maze was Sprout's hedges grown monstrous and Flitwick's charm work, and something darker threaded through it that had Crouch's fingerprints even from custody. The way the maze moved, the way the monsters in it had been placed, the specific dead ends designed to eliminate competitors rather than challenge them. He moved efficiently. He helped Cedric when he found him pinned by a curse from a corner he hadn't seen, because Cedric was decent and had treated Harry fairly across the whole year, and because helping him cost less than 40 seconds and not helping would have cost something Harry valued more than time. Cedric looked at him. "You keep doing that." "Doing what?" "Helping me when you don't have to." "I do have to," Harry said. "That's what you keep not understanding." He looked at Cedric directly. "Come on, the cup's this way." They reached it together, the Triwizard Cup on its stone pedestal, gold and glowing in the maze's heart. Harry looked at it for a moment. He felt Amelia's auras in position somewhere in the maze behind them, 60 seconds away. He looked at Cedric. "I'm going to tell you something and I need you to trust me." Cedric looked at the cup, then at Harry. "All right. That cup is a portkey. Someone made it one. On the other end is someone very dangerous." He kept his voice even. "I need to go through. You don't. Step back and let the auras know what's happening when they come through in 60 seconds. Cedric was quiet for a moment. "Who's on the other end?" "Voldemort," Harry said. "Just the name, no ceremony." A long pause. "And you're going anyway?" "Yes, because you have a plan." "Because I have a plan and because this ends today or it doesn't end for years and I'm not waiting years." He looked at Cedric steadily. "The auras are 60 seconds behind me. Tell them where I've gone. Tell them graveyard. Amelia will know what to do with that." Cedric held his gaze. "You're 14. I've been 14 for 6 months and I've been preparing for this my entire life," Harry said. "Tell the auras." He touched the cup. The graveyard was cold and dark and smelled of old earth. Wormtail was there, Pettigrew, who had somehow escaped ministry custody in March in a prison break that Amelia had described in terse ministry correspondence as a significant failure that I am addressing, and he had a bundle in his arms that moved with the particular wrongness of something trying to be alive without the proper materials for it. Harry had his wand in hand before he landed. Wormtail bound him to a grave marker with practiced efficiency, which Harry allowed because the tactical moment wasn't right yet, and because he needed to see the ritual to confirm the tether theory. He watched and felt the magic happen, the cauldron, the bone from the ground, Pettigrew's hand, and then his own blood taken from his arm without his consent, and felt the moment Voldemort rose. He felt it like weather. The specific cold he'd first recognized in a mirror chamber at 11, then in a corridor outside the bathroom, then in boggart form, then in Dementor proximity. The cold of something old and focused entirely on itself. Voldemort stepped out of the cauldron. Harry looked at him, not with fear, with the focused attention of someone confirming hypotheses. The Death Eaters were summoned. They came, gathering in a circle in the graveyard, 20 of them or more, and Voldemort walked among them with the pleasure of a man who had been waiting a long time for an audience. Harry noted faces where he could see them, committed them to memory. Amelia would want names. Voldemort gave him back his wand. "A duel," he said, "so my followers can see, so history can record the proper ending." Harry took his wand. He rolled his shoulder once, checked his grip. "All right." He cast before Voldemort had finished speaking. Not the killing curse, he didn't know it, had never wanted to know it, and it wasn't necessary. He cast the strongest shield he had, wandless left hand, wand hand, simultaneously firing a reducto at the ground 2 feet in front of Voldemort, which sent a spray of earth and stone fragments up as a sensory disruption. And then he moved because standing still in a duel was the first mistake Sirius had ever taught him not to make. Voldemort was extraordinarily powerful. He was the realest thing Harry had ever felt magically, not stronger than the magic Harry had been building his whole life, but ancient and cold, and entirely without the particular weight that made Harry's magic what it was. There was nothing in Voldemort's magic that had ever loved anything. Harry had been told this, and now he felt it, the difference between power that had been built from connection and power that had been built from conquest, and they were not equivalent. They were not equivalent because Voldemort moved with absolute certainty and Harry moved with complete adaptability, and certainty against an adaptive opponent produces the same result every time. He couldn't win this in 30 seconds. He wasn't trying to. He was trying to survive until the auras came through. He was also trying to confirm the tether. He felt it at the 40-second mark, in the exchange of a spell he deflected, and one that caught him across the arm, not lethal, nothing was landing lethal. His mother's protection humming in his blood like a tuning fork, and in the deflection something passed between them along the shared wand connection, the twin cores resonating, and for a moment he felt it clearly. The warmth in his blood sitting inside Voldemort's construction like an ember, the thing his mother had put in him that was now, through the ritual, threaded into Voldemort's restored body. The tether was real. He let the priori incantatum happen because it was going to happen, the connexus effect of the twin cores, the connection establishing itself when their wands were locked, the gold light stretching between them, and the bead of light forming that he needed to push toward Voldemort's wand. He'd read about this. Hermione had cross-referenced everything there was to find about it. He pushed. The bead moved, the connection established. The shades came out, not just his parents, though his parents were there, his father first and then his mother, and they were not the mythology he'd been afraid of knowing too well, but just themselves, real and clear, and he heard his mother's voice say, when it breaks, run, and he believed her. He broke the connection and ran, not away, toward the cup. The Death Eaters fired. He shielded and kept moving. Voldemort screamed something, rage under the cold for the first time, real emotion, though wrong, though the kind of emotion that consumed rather than sustained, and Harry felt a hex clip his leg and kept moving. He grabbed Cedric's arm as he passed. Cedric was there. He had not waited for the auras. He had come through the cup and was standing in the graveyard with his wand out and the expression of someone who had made a choice. Harry grabbed his arm, they grabbed the cup together, and the portkey yanked them back. They landed on the Hogwarts grounds in a heap. Amelia was there in 40 seconds. She came through a perimeter apparition with 2 auras, and she was in her ministry robes and her monocle was slightly crooked, and she looked at Harry on the ground, leg bleeding, arm cut, alive, and the ministry face held for exactly 2 seconds before it didn't. She crossed the grass and crouched down, and her hand on his face was the most specific thing he'd felt all evening. He's back, Harry said. He used the ritual. Wormtail did it. I got blood taken before I could stop him. He kept his voice even. I need to tell you everything while it's clear. Faces I recognized. Pettigrew was there. He escaped custody. There were at least 20 Death Eaters I identified. Harry, she said. He stopped. Her hand was still on his face. Her eyes behind the monocle were entirely unguarded in a way they weren't often, in a way he'd seen maybe a dozen times in 14 years and which meant something specific. Are you injured? She said, not a question, an assessment. Leg and arm, superficial. He paused. I'm fine. She looked at him for a long moment. Good, she said, tell me everything. He told her everything in order, clearly, while one of the auras worked a healing charm on his leg and Cedric sat nearby looking like someone who'd survived something and was still processing what it meant. When Harry got to the tether theory, Amelia went very still. You confirmed it, she said. I felt it, yes. That's, she paused, and he saw her doing what she always did with new information, organizing it, assessing it, building its implications into her existing architecture. That changes the strategic picture significantly. I know, Harry said. It also means he cannot kill you while you share that connection. It also means I cannot kill him through conventional means while I share it, Harry said, which is fine. I'm not in the business of killing people. That's your department. She almost smiled at that. Almost. It is, yes. She stood up and offered him her hand, and he took it and stood. And the Hogwarts grounds were lit with the castle behind them, and the night sky above, and the specific quality of a moment where something large had just changed and was still settling. Sirius came running across the grounds from the direction of the castle entrance. He slowed when he saw Harry standing. He slowed and then stopped 5 feet away and looked at Harry with the same expression he'd had in the garden 11 months ago when Harry first left for school, the one that was still, years later, not entirely used to the fact. Voldemort is back, Harry said. I'm fine, the tether theory was right. Sirius looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Amelia, who gave him a single nod that carried a large amount of information. Then he said to Harry, the detention record. Hufflepuff Twins, 1989. Harry blinked. What? I've been thinking about it since you told me. 2 twins, 4th year, 7 months. He paused. 13 detentions each. I've done the math. We can beat it. Harry stared at him. Voldemort just came back. He'll still be back tomorrow, Sirius said. We'll deal with it tomorrow. Tonight I need to know if you're in. Harry looked at him. He looked at Amelia, who was watching Sirius with the expression that meant she was choosing not to say something she could say. He looked at Remus, who had appeared at the edge of the group with a blanket over one arm, and was waiting with the particular quiet patience of someone who knew exactly what was happening, and thought it was correct. He looked at all of them, the household, assembled on a Hogwarts lawn at 10 in the evening, Voldemort returned to the world and Amelia already 3 steps into the strategic response, Sirius offering absurdity as anchor, Remus standing by with warmth and patience. And somewhere inside the castle Hermione, who would be waiting with her notebook and her precise furious love for him, and a list of everything he'd done incorrectly that they'd go through together until she was satisfied he'd learned from it. He was 14 years old, and the war that had started before he was born had just started again, and he had every advantage anyone had ever given him. Law, training, love, a tether, a family, and a plan. I'm in, he said. Sirius grinned, the real one, the one that only came out fully when he thought nobody important was watching, all the way to his eyes, the one Harry had been seeing his whole life and never stopped being glad to see. Right then, Sirius said, "We'll do it first year of 6th year. When McGonagall's slightly less suspicious of you, I'll help you plan." "You'll get him expelled," Amelia said, but she was already turning toward the castle, already in motion, already 3 steps into tomorrow. "Come inside, all of you. There's a great deal of work to do and I'm not doing it on a lawn." They followed her in. The castle doors opened and the warm light of Hogwarts came out to meet them, and behind them the grounds were dark and the night was ordinary and the war was real and coming, and none of that was simple or safe or resolved. It was the beginning of the hard part, they all knew it. But they walked in together, and the light was on in every window, and that was, as it had always been, as it would always be, enough to work with.